The snap of a grown man's wrist hitting the mat echoed through a gymnasium that had gone completely, unnaturally silent. 3 seconds earlier, 200 soldiers had been laughing. Now nobody moved. The woman standing in the center of the combat floor wasn't breathing hard. She wasn't even sweating. She just stepped back, rolled her shoulder once, and waited for the next man to step forward, the same way she'd waited for the last 4. Her name was Dana Reeves. She was 33 years old. She worked the night shift in a military hospital. She wore scrubs 6 days a week and had a coffee stain on her left sneaker that she'd never bothered to clean. She had also just dropped a decorated combat sergeant in under 4 seconds. And not a single person in that room knew why, or what she was actually capable of. If this story already has you hooked, follow my channel so you don't miss what happens next. Like this video, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The base sat against the edge of the Bitterroot Range like it had been forgotten there. Caldwell Army Installation, 40 miles outside Heron Falls, Idaho, was not a glamorous posting. It processed soldiers moving between deployments, ran a trauma hospital that served the surrounding 3 counties, and hosted an annual combat readiness tournament that had, over the years, become the unofficial measure of every enlisted man's pride on the base. Dana Reeves had worked the night shift at Caldwell Medical Center for 14 months. She had applied for the transfer the same week she separated from active service, citing personal reasons on the form, leaving the rest blank. The hiring officer had looked at her discharge papers, noted the classification stamps across the top, and didn't ask follow-up questions. Most people didn't when the stamps were that color. She liked nights. Nights were honest. The emergencies that came in after midnight didn't have time to be performative. No family members staging grief for an audience. No administrators wandering the floor looking for metrics. Just the wound and the person attached to it and the work required to keep one from consuming the other. Her patients liked her, mostly because she didn't pretend. She didn't tell them it wouldn't hurt. She told them it was going to hurt, that the hurt meant something was happening, and that if they could hold still for 30 seconds, she could get ahead of it. That honesty made people trust her in a way that softer words never managed. Her coworkers thought she was competent and strange. The competent part was undeniable. The charge nurse, a 20-year veteran named Sylvia Ortega, had told the medical director after Dana's 3rd week that the new hire moved through a trauma bay like somebody who had practiced in worse places than this. The strange part was harder to name. Dana didn't socialize. She ate lunch alone or not at all. She never mentioned where she'd been stationed before Caldwell, and when someone asked directly, she had a way of redirecting the conversation that felt so natural, the other person usually forgot they'd asked. She had one photograph taped inside her locker. A landscape shot, mountains and low cloud, no people in it, no identifying features. Nobody knew where it was taken. She ran 5 miles before every shift, in the dark, with no headphones. None of this on its own was suspicious. The base was full of people carrying things they didn't discuss. What made Dana noticeable, what made her the subject of a particular kind of attention, was the tournament registration form she dropped in the collection box outside the administrative office on a Tuesday morning in late October. The clerk who processed the forms brought it to Sergeant First Class Hector Vance as something between a joke and a curiosity. "One of the nurses signed up," Hector said, standing in the doorway of the training room where Master Sergeant Brent Calloway was wrapping his hands. Calloway was the base's senior combat instructor. He had placed first in the tournament 4 years running. He was 6'2", 230 pounds, and had a jaw like a cliff face. He was not a cruel man exactly, but he had a sharp instinct for hierarchy, and he had built his identity on being the clearest, most undeniable version of the thing he was. He looked up from his hands. "What kind of nurse?" "Night shift trauma." "Reeves." "I looked her up. She's been here about a year. Before that, nothing on record worth mentioning." Calloway finished wrapping his right hand. "How old?" 33. "What's her weight class?" Hector checked the form. "She didn't enter one. She just wrote open." Calloway looked at him for a moment, then smiled, not warmly. "Let her in. Make sure she's on the bracket early so people see it." The story spread the way things spread on a closed military base. Fast, with embellishment. By Thursday, half the enlisted personnel had heard that a civilian night shift nurse had registered for the open combat tournament. By Friday afternoon, it had become a story people were telling as entertainment. Dana heard about it third hand through one of the ER techs, who told her with the slightly embarrassed tone of someone delivering unwelcome news. She was restocking a supply cart at the time. She didn't stop restocking. "People are going to show up just to watch," the tech said. "I know," Dana said. "I'm just saying, Calloway's going to be there, and he's—" "I know who he is." The tech shifted his weight. "Are you actually going to compete?" Dana set a package of gauze on the shelf. "I registered, didn't I?" She said it without heat, without defensiveness. Like it was the only logical answer to the question, which, as far as she was concerned, it was. Tournament day was a Saturday. The main gymnasium was standing room by 9 in the morning. Dana arrived at 8:40 with a duffel bag over one shoulder and a travel mug in her hand. She wore plain black athletic gear with nothing written on it, no insignia, no unit patch. The absence of branding as conspicuous on a military base as the most elaborate uniform would have been elsewhere. She checked in with the registration table, was assigned her bracket position, and found an empty section of bench at the far end of the room. She sat alone. She didn't look around. The soldier who drew her first was a staff sergeant named Kevin Marsh, 26 years old, who had spent the previous afternoon being congratulated by his friends for the easiest first-round draw of the tournament. He was not a bad fighter. He'd trained seriously for 2 years, had decent footwork and a hard right hand. He stepped into the circle across from her with the posture of someone who wanted to get this over with so he could move on to the real competition. The referee gave the signal. What happened in the next 11 seconds was difficult to describe to people who hadn't seen it, and the people who had seen it spent the rest of the day trying. She didn't attack immediately. She waited, just a half beat, barely perceptible. And in that half beat, she did something with her eyes and her weight that made Marsh commit to a direction before he'd decided to. When he moved, she was already elsewhere. She redirected his momentum with a grip that looked almost gentle, and then there was a sequence of things that happened too quickly to track individually, and then Marsh was on the mat, face down, one arm locked behind him at an angle that made several watching soldiers wince. He tapped. She released. She stepped back. The gymnasium was quiet for a moment. Then it wasn't. But the noise had changed quality. It had moved from entertainment to something closer to attention. Dana walked back to her bench. She picked up her travel mug. She took a sip. The second match was against a corporal named James Treloar, who was faster than Marsh and had watched the first bout carefully. He came in lower, trying to close the distance and take it to the ground on his terms. He was technically proficient. He lasted slightly longer. The outcome was the same. By the third match, the laughter had stopped entirely. By the fourth, people were moving from the edges of the gymnasium toward the center. Brent Calloway watched all of it from his position near the east wall, arms crossed, face unreadable. He watched the way she moved between opponents, the economy of it, the complete absence of wasted motion. He watched the way she stood between bouts, not relaxed exactly, but contained, like someone holding a great deal of something very carefully. He didn't like what he was seeing. Not because she was beating people. He'd seen surprises before. He didn't like it because he recognized the shape of the training underneath the technique, and the shape was wrong for a nurse. He flagged down a junior officer near him. Find out where she was stationed before Caldwell. "Sir, her file might be— I'm aware her file might be restricted. Find out what you can." The semifinals drew every off-duty personnel on the base and a substantial portion of the on-duty ones who found reasons to be near the gymnasium windows. Dana's semifinal opponent was Sergeant First Class Tomas Garza, Hector Vance's original pick for runner-up. Garza was 31, a former wrestling champion from his home state, and he was not someone who underestimated opponents on principle. He'd watched every one of Dana's matches with serious attention and had a specific strategy. It was a good strategy. It didn't work. The match lasted 4 minutes, longer than any of her previous bouts. Garza was stronger, and he fought smart, keeping her moving, trying to exhaust her positioning before going for control. Dana let him work for it. She made him spend energy. And then, in the third minute, she made one deliberate adjustment, almost invisible, a shift in how she was distributing her weight. And Garza, who had built his entire approach on reading her balance, responded to something that wasn't real. She was through his guard before he processed that he'd been misled. And 30 seconds later, the match was over. The gymnasium erupted. It wasn't entirely celebratory noise. It had something jagged in it, something unsettled, the sound of 200 people recalibrating their understanding of something. Dana stood in the center of the mat, chest rising and falling, a thin line of sweat along her jaw. Someone near the front started clapping. It spread imperfectly, a few people joining at a time. She didn't acknowledge it, not dismissively. She simply wasn't performing for the audience. She picked up her water bottle, drank, and waited for the official confirmation that she'd advanced. That was when Calloway walked toward her. He moved through the crowd with the ease of a man who was used to having space open in front of him. And it still opened for him now, even though some of the people stepping aside were doing it less automatically than they once might have. He stopped 3 feet from her, close enough to establish that this was not a casual approach. He was smiling. It was the wrong kind of smile. "I have to admit," he said, loud enough for the nearest rows to hear, "you're better than I thought you'd be." Dana took another drink of water. "Thank you. Technique's interesting. Old school. Where'd you pick it up?" "Different places." "Different places." He repeated it like it was a strange answer. "You train formally?" "Some." "Compete before?" "Not for a while." He nodded slowly, looking at her the way a person looks at a piece of machinery that's operating outside its specified parameters. "You know who you're fighting in the final." "I saw the bracket. I've won this 4 years straight." Dana recapped her water bottle. "I read that too. I just want you to be realistic about what you're walking into." She looked at him directly for the first time in the conversation. Her expression wasn't hostile. It wasn't particularly warm either. It was the look of someone who had dealt with a version of this conversation many times before and had long ago stopped finding it surprising. "Is there something specific you want to say to me, Sergeant?" He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, quietly enough that only she and perhaps 1 or 2 others caught it, "Withdraw before the final. Do it now. Cite an injury. You've already made your point. Don't make an enemy of me." She considered him for exactly 3 seconds. "I'll see you on the mat," she said, and walked away. There was a 2-hour break before the final. Dana used it to sit on the floor of the women's locker room with her back against the wall and her eyes closed. She wasn't sleeping. She was running through something internal, inventory, calculation, the kind of pre-operational accounting that had been drilled into her over years until it was as automatic as breathing. She knew Calloway was better than anyone she'd fought today. She'd watched enough of his previous matches to map his tendencies. He favored pressure, close range, overwhelming his opponents with force and forward momentum. He was patient in a way that surprised people who only saw his size. He would try to tire her and then close the distance. She also had known since the moment he walked over and said what he said, that this had stopped being about a tournament. The problem with Calloway wasn't that he was dangerous. The problem was that he was institutional. He was 12 years of rank, of relationships, of the kind of authority that didn't live in the rank alone, but in every interaction that rank had accumulated over time. If she beat him, she wasn't just beating a sergeant. She was making a statement that would ripple through a social ecosystem she didn't fully understand yet, one she'd be living inside for however long she stayed at Caldwell. She knew this. She got up, stretched her neck left and right, and went back out. The gymnasium was at capacity by the time the final started. People were standing along every wall, sitting on equipment cases and window ledges, crowded into the doorways. There were base personnel Dana had never seen, officers who didn't typically attend this kind of event, hospital staff who'd heard the story through the afternoon. Sylvia Ortega, Dana's charge nurse, was there. She'd come straight from the end of her shift and stood near the east wall still in her jacket, watching with the particular stillness of someone who was revising an opinion they'd held with confidence. Calloway came onto the mat to a response that had visible effort in it. Cheers from his people, scattered applause from others. He was in his element. This was the arena he'd built around himself, and he knew exactly how to inhabit it. Dana came onto the mat to something quieter, real attention, the kind that doesn't announce itself. The referee reviewed the rules. Standard format. Controlled contact, tap out, or referee stop, no strikes below the knee and standing clinch. Dana noted the last rule and filed it away. When the start signal came, Calloway didn't rush. He moved laterally, measured her, let the first 10 seconds be information gathering. She matched him, moving with him, not away. She wanted him to read her as someone who would engage at close range. He feinted. She didn't react. He feinted again, differently. She tracked it, but didn't commit. He smiled briefly, then stepped in hard. The next 60 seconds were the most technically complex sequence of the day, and most of the people watching couldn't follow the specifics. Only the texture of it, which was that two very capable people were operating at a level the previous matches hadn't reached. Calloway was strong and fast, and his forward pressure was relentless. Dana was giving ground deliberately, absorbing his advances in ways that cost him more than he was recovering. At the 70-second mark, he shifted his approach, went lower, trying to take her balance, and Dana stopped retreating. The transition was so abrupt it disrupted his timing. He'd been reading her movement to inform his own, and suddenly the information changed. He adjusted, but the adjustment created a fraction of an angle that wasn't there before. And Dana had built her entire approach around being ready for that fraction. What followed was brief and decisive. She didn't overpower him. She redirected him, a leverage sequence that used his own forward drive to put him somewhere he hadn't intended to be. And by the time he identified the problem, her grip was established and the geometry was wrong. He lasted another 18 seconds working against it. Then he tapped. The silence lasted longer this time. Long enough to be uncomfortable. Long enough for Dana to step back, breathe, and look toward the referee for the official call before she let herself think anything about what had just happened. Then the noise came, and it was different from anything the gymnasium had produced all day. It wasn't uniform. It was fractured. Some people were genuinely cheering. Some were clapping with the careful energy of people who weren't sure yet what they were endorsing. Some were standing very still. Calloway got up slowly. He was unhurt, but the deliberateness of how he rose made it clear he was managing something. He didn't look at her immediately. When he finally did, his face had gone into a register she couldn't entirely read, somewhere between calculation and anger, controlled tightly enough that only the edges showed. The referee raised her arm. Dana stood there, breathing hard now, finally, the hour of accumulated exertion arriving all at once, and looked out at the room full of people who 12 hours ago had come here to watch something funny. She thought of the photograph in her locker. Mountains, low cloud. She thought about the last time she'd stood somewhere and had this exact feeling, the specific relief of a completed thing, and the memory was years old and came from a context she could not talk about in this room. She didn't smile for the audience. She didn't look for reaction, but something tightened in her chest. Not pride exactly, not satisfaction. Something more complicated than that. The awareness of what she'd just made visible and what it would cost her. Because she'd seen the look on Calloway's face, and she'd spent enough years reading people in high-pressure moments to know that a man like him didn't process a loss like this and move on. He processed it and got organized. She picked up her bag. She walked toward the exit. Behind her, the gymnasium buzzed and fractured into 100 separate conversations, and somewhere in the back of the room, Brent Calloway stood with his arms at his sides and his jaw set, and his phone already in his hand. He wasn't calling to congratulate her. She was halfway across the parking lot when she heard the footsteps behind her. Two people, moving fast, then slowing when they realized she'd heard them. She didn't turn around immediately. She adjusted the duffel strap on her shoulder, took 3 more steps, then turned. 2 men she didn't recognize, both in civilian clothes, both carrying themselves like people who were used to moving in uniform. The taller one had a lanyard tucked into his shirt pocket. She caught the edge of a base access badge before he pushed it down. "Ms. Reeves, that's me. Good tournament today." She waited. "We'd like to talk to you, when you have time." "About what?" The shorter one glanced at his partner. Something passed between them, the kind of abbreviated communication that meant they'd had a version of this conversation before and had agreed on how much to say. "Just a conversation," the taller one said. "Nothing official." She looked at them both for a moment. "I work nights. I'm off until Monday." "We know." "I'll think about it," she said and kept walking. They didn't follow. She drove back to her apartment off base without the radio on. The town of Heron Falls scrolled past her windows. A gas station, a diner with its lights still on, a grain elevator that had stopped operating years ago but still stood at the edge of the highway like something that hadn't gotten the news. She'd been here 14 months and still didn't know the names of her neighbors. She wasn't sure if that was a habit or a preference. Probably both. She unlocked her door, set down her bag, and stood in her kitchen for a moment with the lights off. Outside, a dog was barking somewhere 2 streets over. The refrigerator hummed. She poured a glass of water, drank half of it, and stood at the sink looking at the window above it, her own reflection faint against the dark outside. Her knee was starting to ache. The match had torqued it in the 3rd minute. Nothing serious, just the old scar tissue reminding her it was still there. She'd had the injury for 4 years and it talked to her when she pushed it. She'd learned to treat it like weather. She went to bed. She was asleep in 6 minutes. Bolts. Monday came back to her like a slow tide. The ER night shift started at 7. She arrived at 6:50, signed in, pulled her patient board, and was 3 steps toward the supply room when Sylvia Ortega appeared at her elbow. "Walk with me." The charge nurse's voice had a particular texture when something was wrong. Not alarmed exactly, but compressed. Dana had learned to hear the compression. They walked the length of the corridor toward the staff lounge. Sylvia waited until they were past the occupied rooms. "You have a meeting with Dr. Voss at 8. Dana processed that. Warren Voss was the hospital's medical director. In 14 months, she had never had a direct meeting with him. About what? He didn't specify, but I talked to Karen in admin this morning. Sylvia paused. Someone filed a conduct review request against you on Saturday night. Dana didn't respond immediately. She watched a gurney pass in the cross corridor ahead of them, tracked its movement out of habit. Did Karen say who filed it? It went through the base commander's office, which means it didn't come from within the hospital. They stopped at the lounge doorway. Sylvia looked at her directly. The look of someone who had watched a great deal and was deciding how much of that watching to say out loud. "You're a good nurse, Dana. You're one of the best I've had on this shift in 10 years, and I'm not saying that as a preface to something softer." She paused. "But you made someone uncomfortable on Saturday." "Several someones, probably. The ones with rank." Dana nodded once. "The meeting is at 8, Sylvia said. "Be careful in there." Ought. Dr. Warren Voss was a compact man in his late 50s with reading glasses perpetually pushed up on his forehead and the deliberate patience of someone who had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing he could do in a difficult conversation was rush. He had a reputation as a fair administrator, which Dana had generally found to be accurate, with the caveat that his fairness operated most reliably when it wasn't in conflict with his relationships with the base command. He was not alone in the meeting room. Sitting to his right was a colonel she recognized by face, Marcus Holt, the installation's executive officer who managed administrative relationships between the base and its attached medical facility. She had never spoken with him directly. Holt had the look of a man who had made a decision before entering the room. "Nurse Reeves," Voss said, gesturing to the chair across from them. "Thank you for coming in." She sat. She kept her expression neutral and her hand still on the table. "You're aware a conduct review has been initiated," Voss said. "I was informed this morning. The concern relates to your participation in the combat tournament on Saturday." Voss took off his glasses entirely now, holding them loosely. "Specifically, the nature of the techniques you employed during competition." She waited. "There's a question," Holt said, taking the thread from Voss with the ease of someone who had arranged that handoff in advance, "about whether a civilian medical employee competing in a military readiness exercise and employing advanced combat methods whose origin isn't clearly documented presents a liability concern for this facility." Dana looked at him steadily. "I entered a base-sanctioned open tournament. The events were observed by base personnel and refereed by certified officials. I competed within the stated rules." "The rules of the tournament, yes." Holt set his palms flat on the table. "The question is whether a civilian nursing staff member should be competing in military readiness events at all. There was no restriction on the registration form. There's also no precedent for it. Lack of precedent isn't a conduct violation." The room held that for a moment. Voss put his glasses back on. "Dana," he said, and the use of her first name was deliberate. "Softening, not warm. Nobody here is questioning your clinical record. Your work in this hospital has been exceptional. What we're trying to navigate is a situation that's created some friction." "Dr. Voss?" She kept her voice even. "Was a complaint filed about a specific action I took in the tournament? A rules violation? An injury to another competitor? Voss exchanged a look with Holt. Not a formal one, no, Voss said. Then I'd like to understand the specific basis for a conduct review. Holt leaned back slightly, the micro-adjustment of a man recalibrating. This doesn't need to be adversarial, Reeves. I agree. She met his eyes. So tell me specifically what I'm being reviewed for. Another pause. The kind that meant neither of them had a clean answer to the question. We're going to take a few days, Voss said finally. Review the situation. In the meantime, you remain on your regular schedule. She stood. One more thing, Holt said. She stopped. Master Sergeant Calloway has a significant role in base operations and training culture. Holt searched briefly for the right word. Discomfort with Saturday's outcome has implications that go beyond the tournament. Dana looked at him. I understand. She walked out. Attempt. She was back on the floor by 9, and she worked the rest of the shift with the clean focus she always brought to it. 2 chest pains, 1 pediatric laceration, a diabetic crisis at 2 a.m. that required 40 minutes of careful stabilization. She did the work. She documented. She answered questions from the third-year resident with the patience she always gave to residents who were genuinely trying. She didn't mention the meeting to anyone. At 5 a.m, during the quiet stretch before shift change, she was at the nurse's station charting when she heard the sound of something scraping against metal in the corridor toward the staff lockers. She kept charting for a moment. Then she set down her pen. The locker room was empty when she pushed the door open, or appeared to be. She moved to her locker, touched the latch. It swung open unevenly. The interior had been searched, not ransacked. Nothing thrown around, nothing obviously stolen, but shifted. The order of things inside changed in ways that were small and specific, the kind of careful displacement that was meant to go unnoticed. Her extra stethoscope was there, her spare badge, her medication calculator, her change of clothes, all there. The photograph of the mountains was still taped to the inner door. She stood for a moment looking at it. Then she reset everything, closed the locker, and went back to charting. 2 days later, the note appeared. It was slipped under the door of the women's locker room, not her personal locker, the room itself, which meant anyone could have put it there between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. when the corridor cameras had a known gap. A single folded piece of paper. No handwriting, printed, courier font. You won a tournament. That's all you did. What happens next isn't a tournament. She read it twice, folded it back along its original crease, put it in the pocket of her scrubs. She didn't report it. Not because she was afraid, but because she understood exactly what it was. An attempt to measure her response. To see if she'd run to administration, confirm that she was rattled, give them a framework for characterizing her as unstable or reactive. She went back to work. She started paying closer attention to things she'd been allowing herself to observe only peripherally. The shift in how certain staff moved around her. Not unfriendly, but careful. The way conversations sometimes adjusted when she entered a room. The junior administrator who'd been perfectly collegial for a year and now found reasons to be busy when she approached the scheduling desk. The infrastructure of pressure. She recognized its architecture. She'd seen it operate before, in environments much less subtle than this one. On Thursday, she arrived for her shift to find that her access badge had been temporarily deactivated. She stood at the entry scanner for 40 seconds while it rejected the badge twice, and then a security officer she didn't know appeared and told her, without making eye contact, that there was a system update affecting some staff credentials and to check with admin in the morning. She worked the shift on a temporary badge that had to be signed out and returned. On Friday, the scheduling board showed she'd been moved off the trauma rotation and reassigned to the post-operative recovery floor, a transfer that required a supervisor's signature and that nobody mentioned to her in advance. She went to Sylvia. I didn't authorize it, Sylvia said. She'd said the 3 words with a certain flatness that meant she'd already tried to reverse it and hadn't succeeded. It came from Voss's office. When? Yesterday, backdated to look like a scheduling adjustment. Dana looked at the board. I see. Dana. Sylvia's voice dropped, even though they were alone. I've been here a long time. I know what this kind of movement looks like. What does it look like? It looks like someone building a paper trail, small adjustments. each one deniable individually. She held Dana's eyes. You need to be thinking about whether you want to fight this here or I'm not leaving. Sylvia went quiet for a moment. Okay, she said finally. Then be careful what you put in writing. Everything you document completely. Dates, times, exactly what was said. Don't give them anything to use. Dana nodded once. Thank you, Sylvia. She went and started her shift on the post-op floor. She was good at it. She was good at every aspect of the clinical work, because the clinical work was not the problem. She moved through the recovery bays with the same attention she brought to trauma, because patients in post-op were in their own kind of danger. The quiet danger of the aftermath, the period when the acute crisis had passed, and the body was navigating the difficult work of reassembly. She understood that kind of danger well. At 11:40 p.m., she was reviewing a patient's drainage output when her phone buzzed with a notification from the base emergency system, a mass alert sent simultaneously to all on-call and active medical staff. Exercise alert, simulated mass casualty event, training scenario. Bravo. All trauma personnel report. She stared at the notification. Then a second alert came, 6 minutes after the first, and this one had a different header. Correction. This is not a drill. Actual event. Multiple casualties inbound. All available trauma staff report immediately. She was already moving. The story she pieced together later from the radio traffic, from what the paramedics said when they came in, from the details that filtered through in the chaotic first hour, was that a controlled demolition exercise in the Eastern training sector had gone wrong. A secondary charge improperly staged had detonated during the post-blast assessment window when personnel were already moving into the area. 11 soldiers injured, 3 critical. They came through the doors in a compression of sound and motion, gurneys, field medics still in their gear, the particular organized panic of people who are trained for this and are still not entirely ready for it when it's real. The trauma bay flooded. Dana stood at the edge of it for exactly 1 second, taking in the room, the patients, the available personnel. And then she was inside it. The post-op assignment meant nothing. The conduct review meant nothing. The note and the badge and the scheduling manipulation meant nothing because there were 3 people in front of her who were dying at different speeds, and the work required to slow that down was work she knew how to do. He's losing pressure, someone called from Bay 2. She moved there first. A staff sergeant in his late 20s, abdominal trauma, BP dropping. The paramedic had a line started, but the fluid rate was wrong for the presentation. She adjusted it without explaining, began the assessment, called for imaging with specifics that made the radiologist on the phone go quiet for a moment before confirming. The ER physician on duty was Dr. Patricia Lim, competent, solid, 2 years out of residency, and she was currently managing Bay 1. They made brief eye contact across the room. Dana gave her a 3-second summary of Bay 2. Lim gave her a nod that meant, you have it. She had it. The next 40 minutes were the clearest 40 minutes Dana had experienced in over a year. Not because they were easy, but because they were exact. The work had the precision of a thing she was built for, every decision pulling from layers of training that predated Caldwell by many years, that came from contexts she never discussed in this building. She didn't think about that. She didn't think about anything except what was in front of her. Bay 3 was the hardest. Blast injury to the thoracic region. Patient in and out of consciousness. Presentation shifting faster than the numbers suggested it should. She stayed with it. Adjusted. Made 2 calls that the attending would later describe in documentation as having been, and this was the word he used, field level in their intuition. At 12:47 a.m., all 3 critical patients were stabilized. Dana stepped back from Bay 3 and realized she was breathing hard. She pulled off her gloves. Her hands were steady. She became aware gradually that the room had gone somewhat quiet. The specific quiet of a crisis that has passed its peak, when people begin to look at each other and account for what just happened. Dr. Lim was standing 6 feet away, watching her. Good work, Lim said. You too. Lim didn't look away. Dana, where did you learn that thoracic protocol you used in 3? It was a reasonable question. It was the obvious question. And it was the question Dana had been answering in various indirect ways for 14 months. She picked up a chart. "Advanced training," she said. "Long time ago." She heard the door to the trauma bay open behind her. She assumed it was another staff member. She assumed wrong. She turned. The two men from the parking lot were standing in the doorway, the taller one and the shorter one who had glanced at his partner. They were still in civilian clothes. They had base access badges visible now, the real ones, not tucked away. And there was something in the quality of their stillness that made two nurses near the door step automatically to the side without being asked. The taller one looked at her across the room. Then he looked at the three stabilized patients, then back at her. "Ms. Reeves," he said quietly, "I think it's time for that conversation." And somewhere down the corridor, in the direction of the base administrative wing, a door opened that Dana couldn't see. And the sound that came through it was the particular sound of a man whose footsteps she recognized from the combat floor. Brent Calloway, walking toward the trauma bay, with a folder under his arm. Calloway stopped in the doorway. He looked at the trauma bay, the stabilized patients, the equipment, the residue of 40 minutes of controlled crisis. And then he looked at Dana with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not anger, exactly. Something more complicated. The folder under his arm was thick, and he held it the way people hold things they've prepared carefully and intend to use. Dr. Lim moved toward him instinctively, the way any attending physician moves toward an uninvited presence in a trauma bay. "Sergeant, this is a restricted clinical area. I have authorization from Colonel Holt." He didn't look at Lim when he said it. He was still looking at Dana. "Administrative matter?" "Your administrative matter can wait until my patients are... they're stable." He said it flatly, and the fact that he was right, that he'd assessed the room in 10 seconds and correctly identified that the immediate crisis had passed, was its own kind of statement about how carefully he'd been watching. Lim looked at Dana. Dana set down the chart she was holding. "It's okay," she said. "I've got it." She walked toward Calloway. Not quickly. She moved at the pace of someone who was choosing their pace deliberately, crossing a room that felt larger than it was. When she reached the doorway, she stopped close enough that the conversation would stay between them. "Bad timing," she said. "I've been waiting in this building for 40 minutes. His voice was low and controlled. "I came here to deliver something before your shift ended." "What's in the folder?" He held it out. She took it. She opened it. Inside was a formal document. Hospital letterhead, Dr. Voss's signature at the bottom, Colonel Holt's counter-signature above it. She read it once quickly, then read the operative section again more slowly. Effective immediately, Nurse Dana Reeves is placed on administrative suspension pending completion of conduct review, clinical privileges suspended, access to patient care areas restricted. She closed the folder. "Tonight," she said, "after what just happened in there. The timing isn't my decision." "Whose decision is it?" He looked at her without blinking. "Above my level." She held the folder at her side. Behind her, she could hear the quiet sounds of the trauma bay resettling. Monitors, the low exchange between nurses, the particular hum of a space that had been in crisis and was now in recovery. 3 people alive in there who, 40 minutes ago, had been trending in a different direction. "You should know," she said, her voice level, "that I'm not going to make this easy." Something moved across his face. Not surprise, not quite. Maybe the recognition of something he'd already factored in. "I know," he said. She turned and walked back into the trauma bay to finish her handoff notes. She did it methodically, completely. Every observation, every intervention, every dosage documented in the clear, precise language she always used, because the patients deserved that regardless of what piece of paper she was carrying in her left hand. The 2 men in civilian clothes were still near the door. The taller one watched her work. When she finally finished and capped her pen, he crossed the room toward her. "Ms. Reeves, we should talk tonight." "It's almost 2 in the morning." "Yes." She looked at him. "Who do you work for?" He glanced at the folder in her hand. "People who've been looking at a lot of documents about you. Some of them older than this one." She considered that for a moment. "There's a diner on Route 9, the Lantern. It's open all night. We'll be there in 20 minutes. The Lantern was the kind of place that existed in inverse relationship to pretension. Vinyl booths, fluorescent light slightly too cold for comfort, Coffee that had been burning on its burner since before midnight. It smelled like grease and dish soap and the particular exhaustion of people who worked hours that the rest of the world slept through. Dana sat in the back booth with her hands around a mug she hadn't drunk from yet. The two men arrived at 2:17. The taller one slid in across from her. The shorter one, whose name she still didn't have, took the end seat where he could see the door. The taller one put a leather credential holder on the table. She looked at it without picking it up. Department of Defense Inspector General's office. His name was Raymond Croft. "How long have you been on base?" she asked. "We arrived the day after the tournament." He folded the credential holder away. "We weren't there because of you initially. We were there because of a separate ongoing matter involving personnel record management at Caldwell. And then you saw the tournament. And then we saw the tournament." He paused. "And we pulled your file. The accessible portions." "There aren't many accessible portions." "No, there aren't." He looked at her carefully. "That's actually what we want to talk about." She drank the coffee. It was as bad as it looked. "I'm listening." Croft leaned forward slightly. "The investigation we're running at Caldwell is broader than personnel records. We've been looking at a pattern of conduct complaints that were filed over the past 4 years and subsequently disappeared from the system. Complaints against senior staff. Multiple complainants, different departments, same outcome. Documentation that was entered, then altered or removed." "How many complaints?" 31 that we've confirmed so far. Possibly more." She absorbed that number. 31. Not a series of oversights. A system. "What does that have to do with me?" she asked, though she had a reasonable idea. 2 of those complaints were filed by personnel who interacted with Master Sergeant Calloway. 3 more were filed by hospital staff who reported pressure from base command to modify clinical documentation. He paused. "And tonight, 2 hours after a suspension document was delivered to you following a crisis in which you may have saved 3 lives, we think the pattern just got louder." She turned her mug in her hands. "I'm suspended. I don't have access to records anymore." "We're not asking you for records." He held her eyes. "We're asking you to not disappear." She looked at him. "People in your position," he said carefully, "sometimes make a calculation that the quietest exit is the best one. Take the suspension. Let it become a resignation, move to another posting, put distance between themselves and the problem." He paused. "We're asking you not to do that." The shorter man, who had not spoken once since the parking lot, shifted in his seat. It was a small movement, but it refocused the geometry of the conversation. Dana set down her mug. "What exactly are you building?" "A case," Croft said. "One that needs people who are inside the pattern and are willing to say so." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a truck moved past on Route 9, its headlights sweeping briefly across the diner window. "You should know," she said finally, "that if I don't disappear, this gets harder before it gets easier." "We know. And whatever's in my file, the restricted portions, those are going to come up eventually, if I'm attached to your investigation." "We factored that in." She nodded once, slow. "I'll think about it." She left the diner at 2:45. The drive back to her apartment was 10 minutes, and she spent them with the windows down despite the cold, because the cold kept her thinking clearly, and she needed to think clearly. She had been here before, not here precisely, not this diner, not this installation, not this particular arrangement of pressures. But the shape of it was familiar. The slow accumulation of small forces, each one deniable, each one designed to narrow the available space until the only remaining option was the one they wanted you to choose. She'd spent years operating in environments where that same architecture was employed at much higher stakes. She knew its seams. She knew where it was load-bearing and where it was facade. She parked in front of her building and sat in the car for a moment. Then she went inside, set an alarm for 7 a.m., and slept. The suspension letter specified that she was to surrender her clinical badge by 9 a.m. She arrived at the hospital at 8:45, which gave her 15 minutes. Enough time to do 2 things. The first was to find Sylvia Ortega. She located her in the medication room, alone, reconciling the overnight count. Sylvia looked up when Dana came in, saw her face, and went still. "They did it," Sylvia said. It wasn't a question. "Last night, after the mask has." The older woman set down her clipboard slowly. Her jaw tightened, not at Dana, but at something that extended past this specific room, past this specific event. The jaw tightening of a person who has watched an institution do something they recognize as wrong and are trying to decide in real time what that recognition costs them. I need to ask you something, Dana said. Ask? In the last 4 years, complaints you know about. Formal ones about conduct, senior staff, command pressure on clinical staff, things that should have gone somewhere and didn't. Sylvia was quiet for a moment. Why? Because someone is counting, and I want to know if you're one of the people they should talk to. Another silence, longer this time. Sylvia picked up her clipboard again, not to look at it, just to have something in her hands. There were 2 nurses, she said, before you came. Both filed harassment complaints against a senior administrator. Both were transferred within a month. I signed one of the incident reports myself, and when I tried to follow up 6 weeks later, the report wasn't in the system. Do you still have your copy? I have everything in paper. I've kept paper since 2019. Dana held her eyes. Hold on to it, all of it. She surrendered her badge at 9:03. The security officer gave her a temporary visitor pass, the specific indignity of being reduced to visitor status in a building where she had saved lives 12 hours ago, and she used it to collect the contents of her locker. The photograph of the mountains, the stethoscope, the 2 spare badges she no longer needed. She paused in front of the open locker for a moment. Then she took the photograph off the door, folded it once, and put it in her jacket pocket. She drove home. She made coffee that was better than the lanterns. She sat at her kitchen table and wrote 3 pages of documentation in longhand, dates, times, events, exact words where she remembered them, covering everything from the tournament through the suspension delivery. She was specific. She was unemotional. She wrote the way she charted, without editorializing, because the facts, arranged in their correct order, were already a story. 4 days passed. She ran in the mornings, she grocery shopped, she read. She was performing the surface of a woman who had been suspended from her job and was managing that fact, because that was the performance that cost her the least right now. Underneath it, she was doing other things. Croft contacted her on day 2 through a secure messaging application he'd given her the details for at the diner. Brief exchanges, logistical. He confirmed that her documentation had been received and that the investigation was expanding. He did not tell her how, or how fast, or what the timeline looked like, because he didn't know yet, and he was not the kind of person who manufactured certainty for the comfort of his witnesses. She appreciated that. On day 3, someone slashed her front passenger tire in the apartment parking lot. She discovered it at 6 a.m. when she went to run. She stood looking at it for a moment in the pre-dawn cold, then changed into different shoes and ran her 5 miles anyway. She called a tire service at 8 and paid for the replacement herself. She documented the tire, time, description, photograph, added it to the file. On day 4, she received a call from a number she didn't recognize. When she answered, the voice on the other end was male, young, uncertain in a way that meant genuine nervousness rather than performed hesitation. Is this Dana Reeves? Depends on who's asking. A pause. My name's Farrell, Owen Farrell. I was a corporal. Medical logistics, Caldwell. I separated 6 months ago. She went to her window, checked the parking lot out of habit. Nothing unusual. How'd you get this number? The guys from the IG office. They gave it to me. They said you might... He stopped. I filed a complaint 2 years ago about inventory discrepancies in the medical supply chain. Controlled substances, mostly. Small amounts, but regular, over time. Another pause. The complaint disappeared. I got a performance review 2 weeks later that was bad enough that I knew what it meant. She pulled a chair from the kitchen table and sat down. What do you want, Owen? I want to know if what they're saying is real, that there's actually something happening, because I've been... His voice shifted slightly, lost a layer of control it had been working to maintain. I've been carrying this for 2 years, and I want to know if it was worth it. She thought about how to answer that. She could give him the version that felt reassuring. She could also give him the version that was true. I don't know yet if it's real, she said. I know people are looking seriously. I know you're not the only one. She paused. I know that a complaint that disappeared still happened. The record of it existing might be gone, but you remember it. That matters. He was quiet for a moment. Okay, he said. Okay, talk to Croft. Tell him about the inventory discrepancies in detail. Dates, products, amounts, who had access, all of it. What if they come after me again? I'm out now, but I'm still connected to people on base. Document everything from this point forward and talk to Croft. She hung up and sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. Owen Farrell, controlled substances, medical supply chain. She added the name and the outline of the conversation to her file. The shape of the thing was getting larger. On day 6, Brent Calloway made a mistake. She was at the grocery store, the one on the north side of town that was slightly farther from her apartment but had a better produce section, when she turned into the canned goods aisle and found him standing 10 feet away, looking at her. It was so clearly not accidental that they both registered that fact simultaneously. He had followed her here, or had been waiting for an opportunity like this. It amounted to the same thing. He looked tired, not physically. He was as physically imposing as he'd been in the tournament, but there was something worn in his face, in the area around his eyes, that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago. She recognized it because she'd seen it before, in other contexts, on other people. The specific exhaustion of a person who has set something in motion that is moving faster than they anticipated. "Dana," he said. She kept her basket in her hand. "Brent." Neither of them moved for a moment. "I want to talk to you," he said. Not officially. Not through channels. "We're in a grocery store." "I know," he exhaled. "I know how this looks." She waited. "The suspension wasn't my call," he said. "The specific timing of it. I won't pretend I didn't know it was coming, but last night wasn't my decision. The folder had your base commander's signature. Holt makes decisions based on information people give him. He's been getting information from people who have reasons to want you gone. And you're one of those people." He didn't deny it. "I was. Initially." He shifted his weight, a physical discomfort that was not tactical, not performed. "After the tournament, I went to Holt. I told him your technique raised questions about your background, that your presence was creating instability in the training culture." He paused. "I believed that, most of it." "And now?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Someone broke into my quarters last week. Didn't take anything, just went through things. My files, my personnel records going back 8 years. He said it with the flat tone of a man reporting a fact that deeply unsettled him, but that he was too controlled to express fully. "I've been trying to figure out what they were looking for." She held his eyes. "And? I think they were looking for leverage. On me, specifically." He paused again. "I think some of the people who used my complaint against you as a starting point have their own interests that aren't what I thought they were." She adjusted her basket. "Brent, are you telling me someone is running a play you didn't know you were part of?" He said nothing, which was its own answer. She considered him. He was not a good man exactly, not in the simple sense of the word. He had gone to Holt, had used his position and his relationships to pressure someone he'd assessed as a threat to his standing. He had done it deliberately and with full awareness of what he was doing. She was not interested in forgiving that, but she was interested in what he knew. "I'm going to give you a phone number," she said. "A federal investigator. You call him, you tell him everything you told me and everything you didn't tell me that I know you're not telling me." She paused. "You do that voluntarily before they come to you. That's the only window you have." He stared at her. "You're already in contact with—" "Call the number," she said. "Today." She moved past him and continued down the aisle. She didn't look back. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed this the way she noticed most things about her own physical state, with a kind of clinical detachment, as information about her current condition. She was not shaking. She was not particularly afraid. She was, however, very angry. Not the hot kind of anger, but the long-burning kind, the kind that had been building for 2 weeks of notes under doors and slashed tires and suspension letters delivered at 2 a.m, the kind that didn't cloud judgment, but sharpened it. She went home and called Croft. "Calloway is going to contact you," she said when he picked up. "He may know things about the people above him that are more significant than his own conduct. How confident are you?" "Confident enough to give him your number." A brief pause. "What changed?" "Someone went through his files." Whoever is running this thing above his level got nervous about something and started covering flanks. He's realizing he's a flank. Okay. She could hear him writing. Good work. She almost said it wasn't work. It was a grocery store. But she let it go. Calloway called Croft that evening. She didn't know what was said. Croft sent her a 2-word message that night. He talked. She read it, set her phone face down on the nightstand, and stared at the ceiling for a while. She thought about the photograph in her jacket pocket. The mountains. The low cloud. She'd taken that picture herself from a location she'd never been able to name aloud in any unclassified conversation. She'd taken it at the end of a mission that had lasted 11 days and had cost 2 members of her team things they would spend the rest of their lives carrying. She'd taken it because she needed one thing from that place that was just a landscape, just a view, with no tactical weight attached to it. She kept it because it reminded her why precision mattered, why the work mattered, not abstractly, concretely. Specific people whose specific lives had depended on her being exactly as capable as she was. Caldwell's version of that calculus was smaller in scope, but the principle was identical. You did the work precisely because the alternative had a human cost. She got up, drank a glass of water, and went back to sleep. On day 9, the investigation changed shape. Croft called her at 7 a.m., not through the app, on her actual phone, which meant something had shifted in the urgency level. We found the archive, he said. What archive? The complaints, all 31 of them, plus 14 we hadn't identified yet. They weren't deleted from the system. They were reclassified and routed to a subdirectory that was accessible only to 2 administrators, one of whom is no longer at Caldwell. Who's the other? A pause. Colonel Holt. She sat down. 45 complaints. Not sloppy management, not an oversight, a deliberate, sustained 2-person operation spanning 4 years minimum. There's more, Croft said. The controlled substance discrepancies your caller mentioned. We subpoenaed the supply chain records. It's not small amounts. Over 30 months, it's significant enough to involve a procurement contractor. A contractor, one with a separate relationship with the base that involves several large infrastructure contracts. He paused. This is bigger than misconduct complaints, Dana. This is financial fraud. Federal. She pressed her back against the chair. How long before you move? We're not there yet. We need documentation that ties the complaint suppression directly to the financial interests. Right now, we have parallel tracks. How do you connect them? We need someone inside the administrative structure who can speak to both. She thought about that, about who inside that structure she'd spoken to, who'd spoken to her, who was now carrying the weight of knowing what they knew. Calloway, she said, does he know about the contractor? He knows about one meeting. He wasn't sure of the significance at the time. He'll be sure now. We're interviewing him tomorrow. She spent the rest of that day doing something practical and physical. She cleaned her apartment, reorganized her bookshelves, washed every dish she owned. Physical order when the larger situation was in motion, and she couldn't directly accelerate it. She'd learned that about herself years ago. She needed to be doing something with her hands, or she'd spend the energy on unproductive calculation. At 4 in the afternoon, her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered. The voice was not one she recognized. Male, older, with a quality of deliberate calm that she immediately identified as practiced rather than natural. Ms. Reeves, I want to give you one opportunity to resolve this situation quietly. She moved to her window, parking lot. Nothing unusual. Who is this? Someone who can make the suspension disappear. Your record restored. A transfer to any posting you want. Better posting than Caldwell. Better pay grade. The voice paused. All of that in exchange for a simple conversation with some people who'd like to understand the scope of your interactions with federal investigators. She watched a car pull into the lot below. Not a vehicle she recognized. It parked. Nobody got out. You want me to tell you what I've said to the IG office? She said. A conversation, that's all. And if I decline? Another pause. Then the situation at Caldwell becomes significantly more complicated for you. The suspension becomes a termination. The termination creates a record that follows you. A beat. And some of the materials from your classified file become relevant to a question about whether your separation from service was entirely clean. She felt the specific anger again, the long burning kind. Clean, as though her record wasn't classified because it was exceptional, as though the reason nobody could read it was because it was problematic rather than because it described operations that the people on this phone couldn't be trusted with. "I need you to understand something," she said. Her voice was completely level. "I spent years working in environments where people used exactly this kind of offer to identify who could be leveraged and who couldn't. I know what this call is, and I know what it means that you made it." Silence. "It means you're afraid of what I know," she said, "which means you already know I'm not going to take the offer." She hung up. She called Croft immediately, told him about the call in precise detail, the exact wording of the offer, the exact wording of the threat, the parked car below that was still sitting there, unmoved, engine presumably running. Croft listened without interrupting. "Can you record your calls?" he asked when she finished. "I can." "Do that going forward. And Dana?" He stopped. "Say it. They just showed you they know you're talking to us, which means someone on or near this investigation is passing information." A pause. "We're going to move faster than I originally planned." The car in the parking lot sat there for another 40 minutes. Then it left. She stood at the window long after it was gone, watching the empty space where it had been, turning the call over in her mind. Not the threat, but the offer. The specificity of it. Materials from your classified file. They'd been in her file. Not the accessible portions. Deeper. Someone with significant clearance was involved. She was still at the window when her phone buzzed. Not Croft this time. A number she didn't know. A text message. No name. "They suspended me this morning. I kept the paper copies like you said. All of it. S.O. Sylvia. Suspended." She stared at the message for a long moment. Then she typed back, "I know someone you need to call. Tonight." She sent Croft's number. Then she sat on her couch with her hands flat on her knees and thought about 45 complaints and a procurement contractor and a classified file and a car that sat in a parking lot for 40 minutes and left. And she thought about Sylvia Ortega, who had been at Caldwell for 20 years and had kept paper records since 2019 because she had known, on some experienced institutional level, that the day would come when the digital record couldn't be trusted. The shape of the thing was not just large, it was organized. And it had just made the air of showing her exactly how organized it was. Because only a frightened organization called a suspended nurse at 4 in the afternoon to offer her a deal. She opened her longhand documentation and added 6 pages. 2 days later, Croft asked her to come in. Not to the base, to a federal building 40 miles from Heron Falls, in a conference room with no windows and a recording device on the table that he pointed to before she sat down, because he was that kind of person, the kind who pointed to the recording device. She sat across from him and his partner, the shorter one, whose name she now knew was Devin Park, and a third person she hadn't met, a woman from the DOJ with reading glasses and a yellow legal pad and the particular focused patience of someone who had done this many times and understood that patience was the most powerful tool in the room. The woman's name was Andrea Solis. She set her legal pad in front of her and her pen beside it and looked at Dana without preamble. "We'd like to start from the beginning," she said. "Everything." Dana looked at the recording device, then at Solis. "How much time do we have?" Solis glanced at the legal pad. "As much as you need." Dana folded her hands on the table. She took a breath, not a nervous breath, a preparatory one, the kind she took before a procedure that required sustained precision. And she began. She talked for 2 hours and 40 minutes. She was specific. She was unemotional. She answered every follow-up question without deflection and flagged clearly the moments when she was giving opinion versus direct observation. She told them about the tournament and the meeting with Voss and Holt. She told them about the locker and the note and the tire and the supply rotation change. She told them about the mass casualty event and the suspension folder arriving in its wake. She told them about the grocery store and the phone call and the car in the parking lot. She did not tell them about the photograph. Some things were not relevant to the investigation. When she finished, Solis looked at her legal pad for a moment. Then she looked up. "Ms. Reeves," she said carefully, "I want to ask you something that's not directly related to the investigation." Dana waited. Your file, Solis said. The restricted portions. The threat on the phone mentioned them as potential leverage. She paused. We've requested access through appropriate channels. We're not there yet. But when we are, is there anything in there that would complicate your position as a witness? Dana met her eyes. No, she said. You're certain? My record is classified because of what it contains, not because of what it conceals. She paused. There's a difference. Solis looked at her for a moment longer. Then she wrote something on her legal pad. Thank you, she said. We'll be in touch. Dana drove back to Heron Falls on a highway that ran straight through open country, flat and golden in the late afternoon, the mountains visible to the west in the specific blue haze they took on in October. She drove without the radio. She thought about nothing in particular. She was almost back to town when her phone rang through the car speakers, a number she recognized now. Croft. Where are you? He said when she answered. 10 minutes out. Don't go home, he said. Come to the base. Dana? There was something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Not alarm exactly, but the compressed urgency of a development that hadn't been anticipated. Something happened about an hour ago. Her hands tightened on the wheel. Tell me. Calloway, Croft said. He was in the administrative building going through something with one of my people, cross-referencing the contractor's visit logs. A pause. Someone accessed the building security system remotely and wiped 90 minutes of camera footage. By the time we noticed, Calloway was already in the parking lot. Did something happen to him? No, he's fine. But Dana, someone knew he was there. Someone knew exactly what time he was there and what he was looking at. Croft's voice was taut. That's not someone watching from outside. That's someone with access to the investigation itself. She stared at the road ahead, the mountains in her peripheral vision, blue and distant. How high does this go? She said. A pause. That, Croft said quietly, is what we're now trying to figure out. She pressed the accelerator. The car moved faster through the open country, toward the base, toward whatever was waiting there. And in her jacket pocket, folded once, the photograph of the mountains was perfectly still. The base at night had a different quality than the base during the day. Quieter in ways that weren't actually quiet. The silence underlaid by machinery and distant generators and the particular ambient tension of a place that never fully stood down. Dana pulled through the main gate at 7:43 p.m. The guard checked her visitor pass. She was still on visitor clearance, the suspension hadn't been reversed, and waved her through with the mild discomfort of someone who wasn't sure how to categorize her anymore. She drove to the administrative complex and found Croft standing outside the entrance with his jacket collar up against the October cold, phone in one hand, watching her park. He didn't wait for her to reach him. The footage that was wiped? We recovered fragments. Partial frames from the buffer before the deletion executed. He turned and walked as he talked, moving back toward the entrance. Enough to see what Calloway found in the visit logs before someone decided they didn't want him to find it. She followed him inside, through a corridor she hadn't been in before. The administrative building's interior was a different architecture than the hospital. Harder surfaces, fewer concessions to the comfort of the people working in it. Devon Park was waiting in a conference room at the end of the hall. On the table in front of him was a laptop and several printed sheets. Dana sat. Croft remained standing. The contractor, Park said, turning the laptop toward her. Meridian Logistics Group. They hold 3 infrastructure contracts at Caldwell: building maintenance, supply chain management, and IT systems. He paused meaningfully on the last one. IT systems, including base security cameras. She looked at the screen. A corporate filing, standard format, officers listed in a column. They wipe their own cameras, she said. Remote access. Built into the contract specifications. They maintain the system. They have backdoor credentials. Park tapped the printed sheets. The visit logs Calloway found show 14 unscheduled site visits by Meridian personnel over the past 22 months, every one of them to a building that also housed administrative records. How many of those visits coincide with complaint disappearances? Park looked at her. 9 confirmed, possibly 11. She sat back. The shape of it completed itself in her mind. Not all at once. but in the way that complex things resolve when you've been accumulating pieces long enough. The complaint suppression wasn't just Holt protecting his people. It was a coordinated operation between a base administrator and a private contractor with physical access to the records infrastructure. Complaints disappeared because people with keycard access and system credentials made them disappear. And the financial fraud, the controlled substance discrepancies Owen Farrell had flagged, that was Meridian's secondary operation, running alongside the first, protected by the same architecture of silence. "Who at Meridian?" she asked. "We have a regional director," Croft said. "Man named Stuart Gaines. But Gaines doesn't have the clearance level to access the kinds of records that were altered. He needed someone inside." Holt, and at least one other administrator we haven't fully identified yet. Croft pulled out a chair and finally sat. He looked tired in a way he hadn't when she'd first met him in the Lantern. Not incompetent tired, but the tired of someone running hard on a timeline that kept compressing. "The problem is that Gaines is aware we've been on base. The camera wipe tonight tells us he's aware we're getting close to the visit log specifically, which means he's either going to run or accelerate whatever he's protecting," Dana said. "Yes." She looked at the laptop screen. "Meridian Logistics Group. 3 contracts. IT systems. Do you have enough to move on Gaines tonight?" "Not yet. We need the connection between the financial fraud and the complaint suppression documented in a way that survives a defense attorney." He met her eyes. "We're close. Days, not weeks." "Days is a long time if he knows you're looking." "I know." She left the administrative building at 9:15. She sat in her car for a moment, not starting the engine. Through the windshield, she could see the edge of the base gymnasium. The building was dark now, the parking lot empty. She thought about standing in the center of that floor 3 weeks ago and how it had felt like a small thing at the time. A tournament. A statement she hadn't fully meant to make. She started the engine. She was 2 miles from her apartment when the emergency alert hit every phone in Heron Falls simultaneously. The sound of it startled her despite herself. The specific jagged tone of a mass alert, different from everything else, designed to cut through sleep and noise and the insulation of ordinary life. She pulled to the side of the road and looked at her phone. Emergency alert. Structure fire. Eastern Training Sector building. 7 Alpha. All emergency personnel respond. Potential casualties reported. She stared at the message for 3 seconds. Building 7 Alpha was the Eastern Sector's primary operations facility, a 2-story concrete structure that housed training coordination, equipment storage, and, on its upper floor, the administrative offices for the base's training command. Where Calloway worked. She called Croft. He picked up on the first ring. "I see it," he said. "I'm heading there now." "Is it contained?" "Unknown. Fire department is en route. Base emergency response is already on scene." A pause, and in that pause she heard the sound of a car door and an engine. "Calloway was in that building 20 minutes ago finishing a debrief with one of my people." She was already pulling back onto the road. "I'm coming." "Dana, you're on suspension." "Then I'll stand in the parking lot," she said, and hung up. The Eastern Sector was a 10-minute drive from where she'd pulled over. She made it in 7. By the time she arrived, the scene had the organized chaos of an emergency that was 2 stages in, past the initial alarm, into the management phase, not yet at resolution. 2 fire units from Heron Falls were already working. The building's ground floor was actively burning on its north side. The upper floor showed smoke from 2 windows, but no visible flame yet. Personnel were staged in the parking lot at a distance, the mixed population of anyone who'd been near enough to respond. Soldiers in PT gear, a few administrators in civilian clothes, base security moving the perimeter outward. Someone had set up a medical triage area at the far edge of the lot, staffed by 2 medics she recognized from the hospital. She pulled up and got out. Croft was already there, standing with Park at the perimeter line. She crossed to them. "Casualties?" she said. 3 confirmed out, 1 unaccounted for. Croft's jaw was tight. The administrative assistant who worked the evening shift on the upper floor, a woman named Rita Marsh. Nobody's seen her exit. Dana looked at the building. 2nd floor, east side. The smoke was denser there, meaning the ventilation on that side was compromised. A person sheltering in place on the upper floor would have 8 maybe 10 minutes before the smoke itself became the primary threat. Longer if they'd found a bathroom or a room with a door they could seal. Has anyone gone in? Fire team is working the ground floor suppression. They haven't cleared a path to the second floor yet. She looked at the two medics at the triage station, then at the building, then at the firefighters. 4 of them, good equipment, working methodically. They'd get there. They would get there. She calculated the time. She was already walking toward the closest fire team captain when Croft said her name. She stopped. "I know what you're thinking," he said. "The stairwell on the east side is exterior adjacent. It'll have the least smoke accumulation if the ground floor fire is concentrated north. If she's on that side of the upper floor, she's accessible for another—" "Dana, you're a nurse, not—" "I know what I am." She turned to face him fully. "And I know what I can do. Let me talk to the fire captain." He held her eyes for 2 seconds. Then he stepped aside. The fire captain's name was Brennan, a broad woman in her 40s with gear ash on her face and the focused calm of someone managing 12 things simultaneously. Dana reached her at the perimeter of the active suppression area. "The woman on the second floor," Dana said. "East stairwell. Has anyone assessed it?" Brennan looked at her. "Who are you?" "Trauma nurse, Caldwell Medical. I know this building layout. We have a team working the north suppression before we attempt the second floor." "How long?" Brennan's eyes moved to the building, calculating. 6 minutes to safe access, minimum." "I don't think she has 6 minutes on the east side. The smoke accumulation pattern from that window," she pointed. "That's not a room with an open door. She's sealed herself in. She's burning through oxygen faster." Brennan looked at the window. Something shifted in her assessment. Not agreement, not yet, but the particular attention of a professional encountering a data point they hadn't fully weighted. "I need someone who knows the second floor layout," Brennan said. "I know it. I've been in that building." Another second of evaluation. Then Brennan moved. "Rawlings, get her a mask and a jacket. Civilian assist, east stairwell assessment only." She pointed at Dana. "Assessment only. You don't go past the stairwell door without my go." "Understood." The jacket was 2 sizes large and smelled of smoke from a previous call. The mask settled over her face and the filtered air had a slightly chemical quality. A firefighter named Rawlings led her at a controlled jog around the building's south perimeter to the east stairwell access, a heavy metal door set into the exterior wall, separate from the main building entrance. The door was warm, but not hot. Rawlings tested it with the back of his gloved hand, nodded. They went in. The stairwell was bearable, smoke present but not dense, the kind of conditions that meant minutes, not seconds. Dana moved up the stairs with Rawlings at her shoulder, one hand on the railing, reading the environment as she climbed. Temperature, visibility, the sound of the fire, which was audible as a low roar from the north, but felt distant here, separated by concrete and the building's own mass. The second floor door opened onto a corridor, better than she'd hoped. The smoke was high and layered, sitting near the ceiling, the lower 4 feet relatively clear. She stayed low and moved fast. "Marsh," she called. Her voice was muffled through the mask. "Rita Marsh, call out if you can hear me." Nothing for 2 seconds. Then, faint, from the third door on the left, something. A sound that wasn't the fire. She moved to the door. Felt it. Warm, but not critical. Knocked hard with her palm. "Rita, I'm going to open this door. Stay low." She opened it. The woman inside was crouched in the far corner of the office with her jacket pressed against the base of a second door. The interior connecting door, which meant she'd understood instinctively to block the gap. She was conscious, coughing, face pale with the particular grayness of someone who'd been breathing compromised air for too long. Maybe 35. Her eyes found Dana's with the desperate focus of a person who has been alone with a bad situation and suddenly isn't. "Can you stand?" Dana said. Yes." She stood unsteadily. Dana crossed the room, took her arm, and moved her toward the corridor door. Rawlings was already there. "She's ambulatory," Dana said. "Let's go." They went down the stairs faster than they'd come up. At the bottom, out through the exterior door, into the cold parking lot air. And Dana pulled off her own mask and put it over the woman's face because the woman was coughing in the specific way that meant her airway needed it more than Dana's did right now. She got her to the triage station, handed her to the medics with a brief verbal report, duration of exposure, respiratory presentation, no visible burns, possible carbon monoxide inhalation, and stepped back. Her hands were shaking slightly. She noticed this. Adrenaline metabolism, normal, would resolve in 4 minutes. She breathed. Croft was at her elbow. She looked at him. He said nothing for a moment, which was its own kind of response. "The building," she said. "Once it's clear, the administrative offices on that floor. Anything paper-based that survives needs to be preserved. Chain of custody." "Already called it in." He paused. "Are you hurt?" "No." He looked at her for another moment. This man who dealt in documentation and testimony and careful evidentiary procedure, looking at a woman who had just gone into a burning building because the math said there was still time. She could see him recalibrating something, the same way Sylvia had recalibrated, the same way Lim had in the trauma bay. "The fire," she said. "Is it accidental?" Croft's expression answered before his words did. "The origin point is the IT server room. Ground floor, north side." He paused. "Where Meridian system access hardware is physically housed." She stood very still. "They burned their own access point," she said. "Looks like. Which means they know you were about to trace the camera wipe back through the hardware." "Yes." "And Gaines?" "Not on base. Left through the main gate at 6:40 p.m., 2 hours before the fire started." Croft's voice had a controlled flatness to it. "We have a flag on his vehicle and his cards. He hasn't used either." She looked at the burning building. A controlled burn. Not designed to destroy everything, designed to destroy something specific. The server room, the physical hardware that held the access logs, the evidence of 14 unauthorized visits. "He didn't run," she said slowly. "He's not running. He's managing. There's a difference." Croft looked at her. "Explain." "Running is panic. This is a controlled retreat. He's removing physical evidence that he can't sanitize digitally because you already have the digital record secured. He's not going to an airport, Croft. He's going to whoever is above him in this thing, the person with the clearance to access my file." She paused. "The one you haven't identified yet." The silence between them was the productive kind, the kind where both people are thinking in the same direction. "We need to move," he said. "Tonight. I have to make calls." He was already walking, phone coming out. "Stay available, Mocham." She sat in her car for 40 minutes while the fire was brought under control and the eastern sector filled with the organized aftermath of emergency. Equipment being broken down, personnel being accounted for, the specific exhausted relief of an incident that could have been worse. Rita Marsh was in an ambulance getting supplemental oxygen. The building's north wall was scorched but structurally intact. The server room was destroyed. At 11:20 p.m., Croft appeared at her window. She rolled it down. "We have a problem," he said. She waited. "The DOJ attorney, Solis. She got a call at 9:30 from her supervisor in Washington. Somebody above her level made contact with somebody above her supervisor's level." He said it carefully, the way you describe something you're still working to believe. "The contact suggested that our investigation was overreaching its mandate and that a review of our evidence collection methods was warranted." The cold outside moved through the open window. She felt it on her face. "Someone called Washington," she said. "Yes." "That's not Stuart Gaines," she said. "Gaines doesn't have those connections." "No, he doesn't." "Who does?" Croft was quiet for a moment. The parking lot activity moved behind him, people and equipment, and the low sound of radio traffic. "There's a name," he said carefully, "that's come up twice in the last 6 hours. Not in documents we generated, Dee. In documents we requested and were initially denied access to." He paused. "A general officer. Retired 18 months ago. One of 3 people who had the clearance level to access the classified portions of personnel files from the units your file is associated with." She sat very still. "He has a consulting relationship with Meridian Logistics Group," Croft said. "Has had, since 6 months after he retired. The pieces finished assembling themselves. The complaint suppression was a protection mechanism, not for Callaway, not even primarily for Holt. For a network that had been running a financial operation through Caldwell's supply chain for years, protected by a retired general who still had enough influence to reach into an active federal investigation and slow it down with a phone call. The tournament had been the wrong thing to win, not because she'd beaten Calloway, but because Calloway's reaction had set off a chain of escalation that ultimately drew federal investigators to a base they'd otherwise had no reason to prioritize. She'd been the accidental catalyst for exposing something much larger than anybody's ego. "What's his name?" she said. Croft looked at her. "You'll see it in the documents," he said carefully. "When we get there." "When?" "When?" His voice was firm. Solis is pushing back. She's not pulling the investigation. She's challenging the review request through her own channels. She has the legal standing. It'll take a day, maybe 2. A day is a lot of room. "I know." He met her eyes. "Go home. Get sleep. I'll contact you when it moves." She drove home. The apartment was dark, and she left it that way. Didn't turn on lights, moved through the familiar space by memory, set her keys on the counter where they always went. She washed her face, changed out of the clothes that smelled of smoke. She sat on the floor of her bedroom with her back against the bed and her phone on the carpet beside her. Not anxious, exactly. The opposite of anxious. The particular internal stillness of someone who has identified the shape of the problem completely and is now simply waiting for the conditions that allow them to act. At 2:17 a.m., her phone buzzed. Not Croft, not a number she recognized. A text message, no name. Whatever they've told you about the investigation, they have a leak, not from outside. Stop sharing information with the full team, one person only. She read it 3 times. Then she typed back, "Who is this?" The response came 30 seconds later. "Someone who knows what's in your file and who put it there." Her chest did something complicated. She kept her face still. "How do I know this isn't the same people who called me at 4 p.m. 2 weeks ago?" A longer pause this time, 40 seconds. Then, "Ask Croft what Raymond is short for. If he says anything other than the right answer, don't trust him." She stared at the message. She called Croft. He answered on the 3rd ring, groggy. He'd actually been asleep, which was itself information. "What's wrong?" he said. "Quick question. Your first name, Raymond, is that a nickname or is that what's on your birth certificate?" A pause. The pause of a man waking up fully, faster than normal. "What? Raymond, is it short for something?" "No, it's not short for anything." His voice had changed. "Dana, who asked you that?" "I'll tell you in the morning," she said. She hung up. She looked at the text thread. He said no, she typed. "Raymond is not short for anything." The response was immediate this time, as though the sender had been waiting. "Then you have a problem. Because the real Raymond Croft's first name is Ramon. It's been Ramon since the day he was born in Corpus Christi in 1979. The man you've been talking to for 11 days is not who he says he is." The room was very quiet. Her own breathing, the refrigerator, distantly, the photograph in her jacket, hanging over the chair, mountains, low cloud, the specific silence of a high place. She looked at the name on the text. Then she stood up, slowly, and began to think through every conversation she'd had, every piece of information she'd shared, every name she'd given him, Sylvia's name, Owen Farrell's name, the grocery store, the parking lot, the DOJ attorney, every single thing she'd said to Raymond Croft, every single thing that had been fed directly back to the people she was trying to expose. Her hands were not shaking this time. The adrenaline had nowhere useful to go, and her body seemed to understand that. She stood in the dark, and she was absolutely still. And in the stillness she understood, with the cold clarity of someone who has been operating in a compromised environment and has just identified the breach, exactly how badly she'd been played, and exactly what she had to do next. She opened her contacts, scrolled past Croft's number, past the number she would not be using again, and found the one she'd written on paper first before entering it into her phone. Andrea Solis. DOJ. Direct line. She pressed call. It rang 4 times. 5. 6. On the 7th ring, the line connected, and the voice that answered was not Andrea Solis. It was male. It was calm. It was the same voice that had called her at 4 p.m. 3 weeks ago to offer her a deal. "Ms. Reeves," it said, "we've been waiting for you to figure this out." She didn't hang up. That was the first decision, made in the half-second between recognizing the voice and choosing how to respond to it. Hanging up told him she was rattled. Staying on the line told him something too. But she got to choose what? You've been waiting, she said. Her voice was flat, conversational. How long? Since you called Solis the first time. A pause. The pause of a man who is enjoying this, but carefully, the way people enjoy things they've waited a long time for. Her phone has been monitored for 3 weeks. Not by us originally. We inherited the access. She was moving as he talked. Not running. Moving. Deliberately through the dark apartment, pulling on her jacket, picking up her keys, assessing what she needed and what she could leave. Where's Solis? She said. She's fine. Her phone is redirected. She'll see the missed call in the morning. And Croft? The real one? Also fine. He's been in Billings for 4 days coordinating with a parallel investigation. The man you've been meeting with is a private contractor, good at his job as you apparently noticed a bit late. The voice was measured, but under the measure there was something that wanted to gloat, and she could hear it working to stay contained. You gave us a great deal of useful information, Ms. Reeves. She stopped at her kitchen counter, phone in one hand, car keys in the other. No, she said. I didn't. A beat. The names I gave your contractor, she said. Sylvia Ortega, Owen Farrell. I told them to Croft, the fake one, on days 3 and 4. By day 5, I'd already noticed 2 things about his recall pattern that were wrong. He didn't remember a detail I'd mentioned in passing, and he over-remembered something I hadn't said directly. She paused. So I gave him a version, not the real one. Silence on the line. The productive kind from his end. Sylvia's paper copies are not in her apartment, Dana said. Owen Farrell has not been in Idaho for 2 weeks, and the documentation I gave your contractor was accurate in its dates and inaccurate in 3 specific details that would only matter to someone trying to preempt a federal case. She let that sit for a moment. So when you moved on those leads, you moved on bad information. More silence. You're bluffing, he said, but the voice had lost something. The contained enjoyment was gone. Call your people, she said. Ask them what they found. She hung up. She stood in the kitchen for 4 seconds, letting her heart rate do what it was going to do. Then she called a number she had memorized and never entered into her phone, a number she'd been given 11 days ago by a source she'd trusted more than Croft from the beginning, because the source had known things about her file that nobody in Croft's position should have known, and she'd been quietly running 2 tracks ever since. The phone rang once. It's Reeves, she said when it connected. They moved. Their contractor is burned. I need Solis's actual line in the next 5 minutes. The voice on the other end, a woman, older, with the unhurried precision of someone who had been awake and waiting, said, Stand by. The number came through in 3 minutes. Dana called it from the parking lot of her building, engine running, because sitting still in a known location felt wrong and driving gave her options. Solis answered on the second ring, and her voice had the alert quality of someone who had not, in fact, been asleep. I've been trying to reach you, Solis said. I know. My earlier call was intercepted. Your direct line was redirected. Dana pulled out of the lot and drove without a specific destination, just movement. How much do you know about the contractor running as Raymond Croft? A pause. More than I did 6 hours ago. The real Croft called me directly at midnight. His cover was starting to show gaps, and he wanted to get ahead of it. Solis's voice was controlled, but there was an edge under it. I've been trying to determine the scope of the breach. The breach goes through your phone and through Croft's cover operation. The people who set up the contractor had access to your call logs. They knew who you were talking to and when. Dana stopped at a red light in the empty pre-dawn street. The retired general, whatever name you have for him, he's not just a consultant for Meridian. He's the architect. Holton Gaines are operational. He's structural. We've identified him, Solis said. General Warren Speak, retired, Army, 18 months out, as Croft told you. His consulting arrangement with Meridian is structured through a holding company. Took us 2 days to trace it. She paused. And you were right about the clearance level. He accessed restricted personnel files through a database he should have lost credentials to when he separated. He didn't, because the credential revocation was processed by someone in his network. He's been operating inside the system from outside it. For at least 3 years. The light turned green. Dana drove. What do you need from me? The documentation you assembled. The real version. Not whatever you gave the contractor. I can have it to you in 2 hours. I also need something else. Solis paused. The pause of a lawyer organizing a request carefully. We can build the financial fraud case from records. We can connect Speak to Meridian. What we can't do cleanly without a witness is connect the complaint suppression to a direct instruction from Speak's level. Holt can testify to receiving instructions, but Holt's credibility is compromised. He's the one who suppressed the complaints. You need someone who received an instruction and wasn't complicit in following it. Yes. Dana thought about the grocery store, about a man who had looked tired in the canned goods aisle, about a conversation that had felt like a risk to have and that she'd had anyway, because her read on people had been reliable in worse environments than a supermarket in Idaho. I may have something, she said. Give me until morning. She met Calloway at 6 a.m., his choice of location, a parking area at the north edge of Heron Falls, a gravel pullout that overlooked a reservoir that was gray and still in the early light. He was already there when she arrived, sitting in his truck with the engine off, and he got out when he saw her. He looked worse than the grocery store. The tired she'd seen then had deepened and taken root. He had the look of a man who had spent a week trying to calculate something and kept arriving at an answer he didn't like. How'd you know I'd meet you? He said. I didn't. She stopped a few feet from him. But I knew you hadn't run, and you had every reason to run, which meant you were waiting for something. He looked at the reservoir. When they came to me, 6 weeks ago, before the tournament, someone from Speak's network reached out through channels that looked official, told me there was a flag on your personnel file, that you were a security concern, that if I wanted to protect the training program, he stopped. I didn't know about the financial operation. I didn't know about Meridian. They used me to set off the harassment without telling me what it was actually protecting. That's called compartmentalization, she said. I know what it's called. Did they give you anything in writing? He reached into his truck and came out with a manila envelope. He held it out. She didn't take it immediately. What's in it? She said. The communication. The framing of your file is a security concern. 2 emails and a printed memo. I kept copies because I keep copies of everything. He paused. The memo has a reference number. I looked it up. It traces back to Speak's office, from when he was still active. He drafted it before he retired and it got activated after. She took the envelope. This is evidence, Brent. You understand that if you hand this to me, you're in the middle of a federal proceeding. I'm already in the middle of it. He looked at her directly for the first time. I did things I'm not going to try to excuse to you. I went to Holt. I used what they told me about your file. I made your life harder. He paused. I also almost let 3 people die because I was more worried about my position than about what was happening in my own backyard. She held the envelope. The almost is doing a lot of work in that sentence. I know. He said it without deflecting. That, more than anything, was what made her believe him. What happens to me? That depends on what you tell Solis and how completely you tell it. She paused. The memo matters. Your testimony about how you received it and what you were told about its origin matters more. He nodded. Something in his posture shifted. Not relieved, not resolved, just slightly less braced against itself. She left him at the reservoir with Solis's direct number and drove toward the federal building 40 miles east, envelope on the passenger seat, the sky ahead of her going from gray to pale gold at the edges as the sun came up behind the mountains. She was in the federal building by 8:30 a.m. Solis met her in the lobby, which was unusual. Attorneys did not typically come down to lobbies, and Dana understood from that small deviation that the situation had escalated overnight in ways that changed the protocol. They sat in the same windowless conference room. The recording device was on the table. Devin Park was there, the real Park she'd confirmed through the same channel she'd used to reach Solis, and a second DOJ attorney named Marcus Webb, who had driven from Boise overnight and had the slightly crumpled look of a man who'd slept in his car for 2 hours. Dana set the manila envelope on the table. Solis opened it carefully, read the contents, and passed the memo to Webb without speaking. Webb read it and went still in the specific way of a lawyer encountering a document that changes their timeline. When did you get this? Solis said. 6 a.m. Direct from Calloway. He'll testify to the chain of custody? Yes. And to the conversation in which he was directed to use it. Webb set the memo down. He looked at Solis. Between them passed the kind of look that meant they were both thinking the same thing and were deciding who was going to say it first. This connects directly to Speak's active duty tenure, Webb said. The reference number on that memo belongs to a classification action he initiated. It was used post-retirement as a tool to neutralize a witness. That is not a financial fraud charge. He paused. That's obstruction of a federal process. That's abuse of classification authority. That's potentially conspiracy, Solis said. Yes. Dana sat across from them and said nothing, because nothing was what the moment required. We're moving today, Solis said. She looked at Dana. I need you to know that when this becomes public, your file is going to be part of it. The restricted portions, not released in full, but declassified sufficiently to establish why Speak targeted you, which means people are going to understand what you did in service. What you were. Dana looked at the table, then back up. I know. Is that acceptable to you? She thought about the photograph. Mountains, low cloud, the weight of what she'd carried for years that had no name she could say in an unclassified room. Do what the case needs, she said. The next 9 hours were the fastest and the slowest of the month she'd spent at the edge of this thing. Solis's team moved with the efficiency of people who had been building toward a moment and had suddenly found it arrive ahead of schedule. Warrants were drawn. Coordination calls went to the FBI field office in Boise and to DOD investigators who had been running the parallel case in Billings that the real Raymond Croft had been managing. The contractor who'd been running as Croft was identified, located at a motel in Missoula, and taken into federal custody before noon. Stuart Gaines, who had not, it turned out, been running anywhere, was found at a cabin outside Kalispell that was registered to a Meridian subsidiary. He was arrested at 2 p.m, still in the clothes he'd been wearing when he left Caldwell the previous day, seated at a kitchen table with a laptop open in front of him, and the expression of a man who had known, on some level, that the morning was coming and had spent the night not quite believing it. Donna was not present for any of these events. She was at the Federal Building, in a separate room from the conference room, on her 4th cup of coffee, waiting. At 3:40 p.m., Devin Park came in. He sat across from her and looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who has been in this work long enough to develop a very specific emotional register. Not exactly admiration, not exactly relief, something in between that had the texture of recognition. Speak, he said. We have him. She set down her coffee. He was at his home in Scottsdale. He didn't run either. I think he genuinely didn't believe we could get there. The clearance access alone, the document, the contractor network, he thought it was too diffuse. Park paused. He's been charged. Federal marshals executed the warrant at 2:15 local time. Another pause. He asked, apparently, who had initiated the original complaint, who had started the chain. What did they tell him? That it started with a combat tournament. Park looked at her. He didn't know what that meant. She looked at the table. There was a specific kind of feeling that came when something enormous finished happening. Not euphoria, not triumph. Something quieter and more complicated. The feeling of weight that you've carried so long you stopped noticing it, redistributing itself. Holt? She said. In custody. Cooperative. He started talking before they finished reading the warrant. Apparently he'd been wanting to talk for some time and didn't think there was anyone safe to talk to. And Calloway? Park's expression shifted. That's more complicated. He's not charged. The memo establishes he was manipulated rather than complicit in the financial operation, but there are conduct issues related to how he used the information he was given. Certification review, possible reduction. He met her eyes. He handed over evidence voluntarily. That matters. She nodded. It wasn't justice in the simple sense, but then simple justice was a concept that didn't survive much contact with actual event. The suspension, she said, voided as of this morning. Dr. Voss was notified by Colonel Holt's replacement, an interim XO who was brought in this afternoon. Your clinical record is fully restored. Park paused. There's also going to be a formal letter of recognition from the hospital for the mass casualty event and for last night. She thought about Rita Marsh crouched in the corner of an office with her jacket pressed against the base of a door. Rita Marsh is okay? Discharged from medical this morning. Mild carbon monoxide exposure. She'll be fine. Outside the building, somewhere, the day was ending. She could feel it in the quality of the light coming through the small window above the door, the particular gold of late afternoon in October, the specific angle that meant the sun was below the mountains now and the open country was in the long shadow before dark. "There's something else," Park said. She looked at him. He slid a folder across the table. Thin, 3 pages inside, she could tell from the weight. "Partial declassification, authorized this afternoon. Not the full file. Operational details are still restricted, probably permanently. But the classification that Speak generated, the one that flagged your file as a security concern, is officially rescinded and annotated." He paused. "The annotation describes its origin as fraudulent and its purpose as obstructive." She didn't open the folder immediately. She put her hand on it. "What's in the 3 pages?" she said. "A summary of your service record, the parts that can be said now." He watched her. "You should read it." She opened it. The language was precise and bureaucratic, the government's native tongue, but under the bureaucratic scaffolding, the facts were what they were. 7 years of service with a unit whose name was still redacted. Multiple overseas deployments in operational environments that were still classified by location. A list of commendations that included 2 she'd been told at the time would never appear on a document that could be shown to anyone outside the unit. The final entry was recent. Added today, she could tell from the date. Civilian service at Caldwell Army Installation, Heron Falls, ID. Actions in support of federal investigation and patient care under adverse circumstances. Actions consistent with demonstrated character and capability throughout service record. She closed the folder. "Thank you," she said. Park nodded. He stood. "Take whatever time you need in here." He left. She sat alone in the windowless room with the thin folder under her hand and the 4th cup of coffee going cold in front of her, and she thought about nothing in particular for a while. She was good at that. She'd learned it during long operational holds, the skill of emptying yourself out completely so there was room for what came next. What came next, she didn't know yet. That was okay. After a while, she got up, tucked the folder under her arm, and walked out. Tip. The drive back to Heron Falls took 40 minutes, and she made it without the radio, same as always. The mountains were dark shapes against a sky that had gone deep blue, not quite black, the last of the light bleeding out at the western edge. She pulled into her parking lot. Sat. Her phone had 17 messages. Sylvia, 3 of them, in escalating tones of relief. Owen Farrell, who had seen something on the news that was making him feel things he didn't have words for. Dr. Lim from the hospital. 2 numbers she didn't recognize that were probably journalists who had gotten hold of her name from somewhere. She didn't listen to any of them. She went inside. She made food for the first time in 2 days, actual food, eggs and toast, nothing elaborate, and ate it standing at the kitchen counter because she didn't want to sit down yet. She washed the plate. She was drying her hands when her phone rang. Not a number from the 17 messages. A number with a Washington area code that she didn't recognize but somehow wasn't surprised to see. She answered, "Ms. Reeves." The voice was a woman's, older, with the particular cadence of someone accustomed to having full attention when they spoke. "My name is Colonel Diane Ferris, retired. You don't know me directly, but I know your file considerably better than General Speak did." Dana was quiet. "I've been watching this situation for several weeks," Ferris said, "with interest, and I'll be honest with you, with some concern that you might not make it through cleanly. You handled it better than I expected." "Who are you?" Dana said. "Someone who helped build the unit you served in. Someone who has been involved in determining what happens to it next." A pause. "We've been rebuilding. Smaller. Different structure than before. The operational need hasn't gone away, and if anything, the last 3 years have made it clearer." Another pause. "We've been looking for specific people, people whose capability and judgment we can verify." Dana leaned against the counter. "Verify how?" "Sometimes through formal testing." Ferris paused. "Sometimes through observation." The silence stretched for a moment. "The tournament," Dana said. "The investigation. Your handling of the mass casualty event. Your handling of the compromised investigator." Ferris's voice was careful, but not unkind. "We didn't engineer any of it, but when it happened, we watched." Dana closed her eyes for 1 second, opened them. "What are you offering?" "A conversation first. Nothing binding. We're not in the habit of pressuring. A brief pause. But I want to be direct with you, because I think you prefer that. There's a position. Medical operations lead, forward advisory capacity. The work is specific. The environment is demanding. You know what I mean when I say that? She did know. And you think I'm the right fit. I think you just spent a month in a compromised environment, identified a mole in a federal investigation, navigated a coordinated suppression campaign, pulled a civilian out of a burning building, and maintained accurate documentation throughout. Ferris paused. I think fit is not really the question. Dana looked at the window above the sink, her own reflection, faint. Beyond it, the dark parking lot, the quiet street, the ordinary geography of a town she'd been living inside for 14 months without quite inhabiting. When? She said. When you're ready, Ferris paused. Take the week. See what the hospital needs from you in the immediate term. Talk to the people you need to talk to. And then? And then call this number. We'll arrange the conversation. The line ended. Dana stood in her kitchen with the phone in her hand for a long moment. She thought about the photograph. Mountains, low cloud. She'd been carrying it in her jacket pocket for 2 weeks. She walked to the chair where the jacket hung, reached into the pocket and took it out. She unfolded it once and looked at it. Then she folded it back and set it on the counter next to her keys. She was almost ready to sleep when her phone buzzed one more time. A text. The number was one she'd been using as her secondary channel throughout. The source who had known about her file, who had given her Solis's real number, who had been the one functioning piece of the operation she'd trusted completely from the start. The text said, Speak's attorney filed an emergency motion at 7 p.m. tonight, claiming that the declassification of your service summary was improper and constitutes a violation of an existing national security order. She stared at it. The motion was filed in federal court, the text continued, and the judge assigned to it is... She read the name. She sat down on her bed, slowly. The judge assigned to rule on whether her service record could be used as evidence in a federal prosecution. The judge who would determine in the next 48 hours whether the foundation of the entire case against Warren Speak was legally sound, had, 14 years ago, been the attorney of record for the contractor that had provided logistical support to her former unit, the unit whose existence was still classified, the unit whose record Speak had accessed. He knew, the text said, the motion isn't a long shot, it's a plan. He always had a way out. He built it years ago. She looked at the name on her screen. She looked at the 3-page summary in the folder on her nightstand, and she understood, with the cold precision of someone who had been in this kind of situation before, that the case was not over. It had just moved to a different arena. One where her present, her history, and the specific content of those 3 pages were about to become the most contested ground in a federal courtroom, and where the outcome depended entirely on what happened in the next 48 hours before the motion could be heard. Her phone buzzed again. Dana, the text said. They're coming for the folder. She moved before she finished reading the message, not in panic, in the same compressed, deliberate way she moved through every crisis, the way that looked calm from the outside and felt like controlled falling from the inside. She picked up the folder from the nightstand, crossed to the kitchen, and stood at the counter thinking for exactly 4 seconds about where her options were. The folder was 3 pages, physical copies. If someone was coming for it, they were coming for the physical evidence that tied her service record to Speak's fraudulent classification. The document that, in a federal proceeding, could be used to challenge the emergency motion before it was ever heard. Without it, Solis would be arguing from memory and inference. With it, the motion collapsed before a judge could rule. She called the source. 2 rings. How long? She said. Unknown. The motion was filed at 7. If Speak's people moved immediately after... A pause. Could be tonight, could be morning. I wouldn't sleep on it. Who has jurisdiction over the physical copy? Right now you do. It was given to you as the subject of the record. That was intentional. Chain of custody flows from the DOD office that authorized the declassification to the investigative team to you as a subject. Another pause. Which means if someone removes it from your possession improperly, that's a federal crime on top of everything else. They don't care about adding charges at this point. No, they don't. She looked at the folder on the counter. I need to get this to Solis tonight. Solis is in Boise, 3 hours. I know where she is. She hung up and called Solis's direct line, the real one, the one Park had confirmed, and Solis answered on the second ring with the voice of a woman who had not been sleeping. I know about the motion, Solis said before Dana could speak. Webb called me an hour ago. We're already working the response. The folder needs to be in your hands tonight. Physical copy, witness transfer, documented chain of custody. A brief pause. Can you drive it here? I can drive it to the federal building in Heron Falls and have it witnessed by a duty officer. You can have a courier do the Boise leg. That works. Solis paused. Dana, are you safe right now? She looked at the parking lot through the kitchen window. Quiet. 2 cars she recognized. Nothing unusual. For now, she said. Go quickly. She was in her car in 4 minutes. The folder was in a sealed envelope. She'd found one in a kitchen drawer, the large kind, letter-sized, and she'd sealed it with tape and signed her name across the seal the way she'd learned to treat documented materials in environments where chain of custody was a matter of life and not just law. She drove to the federal building with one eye on her rear-view mirror and the specific internal clarity of someone who had stopped being tired somewhere between the 4th cup of coffee and the moment the motion appeared on her screen. The duty officer at the federal building was a young man named Torres, who was 23 years old and had clearly not expected this particular task at 10:40 p.m. on a Tuesday. He processed the transfer with careful, slightly nervous attention to the paperwork Dana walked him through, signed and time-stamped every form, and called the Boise office himself to confirm receipt authorization. When it was done, folder and evidence log, forms filed, courier confirmed for a 2 a.m. departure. Dana sat in the parking lot of the federal building and let herself feel the specific release of having moved something out of danger. Then she drove home. She slept 4 hours. When her alarm went off at 6, she lay in the dark for a moment thinking about nothing, and then she got up. The next 36 hours were the kind that didn't feel dramatic while they were happening, and that she would later understand, in retrospect, had contained more concentrated consequence than most years she'd lived. Solis's team filed their response to Speak's motion at 9 a.m. the following morning. The response was 47 pages, which Dana would never read in full, but whose essential argument Park summarized for her in a brief call. The declassification had been authorized through proper channels. The connection between the authorizing officer and the logistical contractor was 14 years old and had involved no classified material, and the motion itself constituted an attempt to use national security mechanisms to obstruct a legitimate federal prosecution. The judge, the one whose name had appeared on Dana's screen at midnight, recused himself at 11 a.m. She heard about it from Park. She was in a grocery store when he called, which felt appropriate. He recused voluntarily, Park said, before we could file for disqualification. What made him move that fast? Someone showed him a document. A pause. A document indicating that the opposing counsel in the motion, Speak's attorney, had been a client of his firm 11 years ago. Small matter, but recent enough to constitute a conflict. Another pause. Someone found that very quickly. She thought about Colonel Diane Ferris and about the kind of people who watched situations with interest and had spent careers knowing where the documents were. Okay, she said. The replacement judge has a hearing scheduled for tomorrow at 2 p.m. Solis is confident. How confident? She used the word solid. For Solis, that's effusive. Dana bought her groceries. She drove home. She cooked a real meal for the second time in 2 days and ate it at the table, sitting down this time. She did not attend the hearing. She had not been asked to, and she did not need to be there to know what was happening. Park sent her a text at 2:47 p.m. that said 3 words, motion denied, proceeding. She read it, set her phone face down on the kitchen table, and stared at the ceiling for a while. The motion's denial meant the case moved forward intact. It meant the 3-page summary stayed in evidence. It meant Warren Speak, retired general, architect of a 3-year network of complaint suppression and financial fraud. A man who had reached into a federal investigation from his house in Scottsdale and tried to use the machinery of national security as a personal shield, was going to trial with the full weight of what they'd built against him. It meant something else, too, something she sat with for a while before she could name it properly. It meant that the classification he had put on her file, the fraudulent flag, The implication of a security concern, the document he'd used to give Calloway a reason to go to Holt and set the whole chain of harassment in motion, was officially, permanently, formally declared fraudulent in a federal court record. She had not been a concern. She had been a target. There was a difference, and now the difference was on the record. Sylvia Ortega called at 4 p.m. Dana answered it differently than she'd been answering calls for the past 3 weeks. Not guardedly, not with part of her attention still scanning for the angle. Just answered. "I heard," Sylvia said. "Webb's office sent a notification to anyone listed as a witness or affected party." A pause. "How are you?" "Tired," Dana said. It was the most honest answer she had. That's appropriate. Another pause, and in it Dana could hear Sylvia doing the specific thing she did. The quiet recalibration, the repositioning of facts into their final form. "They're reinstating me, effective next week. Voss called this morning." She paused. He was awkward about it, apologetic in the way that people are when they want to communicate that they feel bad without taking specific responsibility. "That sounds like him." "It does." A breath. "Dana, what you did, asking me to hold the paper copies, knowing I had them and knowing when to use them. You kept them yourself for years. Because I knew something was wrong and I didn't know how to make it matter." Sylvia's voice shifted slightly. Not emotional exactly, but fuller. "You knew how to make it matter." Dana was quiet for a moment. Outside, the October light was doing the thing it did in the late afternoon, going gold and specific, the way light does when a season is finishing. "How's the night shift holding up?" A short, genuine laugh from the other end. "Short-staffed as usual. We could use a good trauma nurse." "I know," Dana said. "I'm working on what comes next." She wasn't sure Sylvia understood exactly what that meant, but Sylvia said, "Good," and they talked for a few more minutes about ordinary things. The ER census, a new resident who showed promise, the vending machine on the 3rd floor that had been broken for 6 weeks. And it was the most normal conversation Dana had had in a month, and she appreciated it more than she knew how to say. She called Owen Farrell that evening. He picked up after one ring, which meant he'd been watching for her number. "Is it real?" he said. "Not hello, just that." "It's real," she said. "Gaines is in custody. Holt is cooperating. Speak goes to trial." She paused. "The complaint you filed 2 years ago, the inventory discrepancies. It's in the federal record now. It's real." A long silence on his end, long enough that she checked to see if the call had dropped. "I almost didn't file it," he said. "I sat on it for 2 weeks before I hit submit. I knew what would happen." "I know. And then it disappeared and I thought—" He stopped. "I thought maybe I was wrong about the whole thing. Maybe I'd read the numbers wrong. Maybe it was nothing." "You weren't wrong." "No." His voice was quieter now. Not relieved. Something more complicated than relief. The specific emotion of a person who has been doubting their own perception for years and is only now getting confirmation that their perception was accurate. It didn't feel as good as people expected it to. It never did. "What happens to me now? In the official record, I mean. The bad performance review. That review was generated in retaliation for your complaint. Solis has it flagged. It'll be part of the proceeding." She paused. "It won't fix everything, but it'll be documented for what it was." "Okay." A long breath. "Okay, yeah." She let him sit with it. "Thank you," he said finally, "for taking the call when you didn't know who I was." "You had the right information," she said. "That was you." She hung up and sat for a while in the growing dark of her apartment, thinking about the specific cost of doing the right thing in an environment designed to make the right thing feel like a mistake. Owen Farrell had sat on a complaint for 2 weeks before filing it. Sylvia had been keeping paper records in quiet defiance of a system she couldn't openly challenge. Rita Marsh had pressed her jacket against the base of a door and waited in a burning building, alone. Because she hadn't known yet that there was someone coming. None of them had been heroes in the way stories typically required heroism to look, loud and certain and unafraid. They'd been afraid. They'd doubted. They'd done the thing anyway, imperfectly, at cost. That was the only kind of courage that was actually available to real people. She thought about that for a while. 3 days later, she went back to the hospital. Not officially, she was still technically in transition, the reinstatement paperwork processing through channels at the speed that paperwork moved through military-adjacent bureaucracy. But Sylvia had called that morning and said a staff shortage had combined with a difficult overnight, and Dana had driven over without needing to be asked twice. She changed into scrubs in the locker room. The space felt different, or she felt different in it, which was probably the same thing. She'd stood at this locker when the folder had been searched, when the note had arrived, when the photograph was the only stable thing inside. Now the locker was just a locker. She clipped on a temporary badge, still a temporary badge, which made her exhale a short, dry breath of something that was almost a laugh, and walked out onto the floor. The ER was what it always was, loud in specific patches, quiet in others, the organized unpredictability of a place where the work was defined by what arrived, and you couldn't know what was arriving until it was there. She moved through it, and it received her the same way it always had. The work didn't care about any of the things that had happened in the last 4 weeks. The work cared about what you could do right now. Dr. Patricia Lim found her at the nurse's station an hour in. "I heard you were back," Lim said. "Temporarily, technically." Lim looked at her with the expression she'd had in the trauma bay after the mass casualty event, the one that meant she was updating something. "The thoracic protocol," she said, "from that night. I've been reading about it. The technique you used. It's field-adapted, not standard civilian protocol." "I know. I want to learn it." Lim said it directly, without preamble, the request of a physician who had identified a gap in her own capability and was addressing it without making it complicated. Dana looked at her. "You'd have to unlearn some reflex responses first." "I know. It's uncomfortable." Most useful things are. She thought about that, about what it meant. This young attending physician who had watched her work twice now under acute pressure and had decided that what she'd seen was worth pursuing rather than filing away as an anomaly. "When I'm officially back," Dana said, "come find me." Lim nodded once. That was the whole conversation. The formal proceedings moved faster than federal matters typically did, which Solis had told her was unusual and which Dana understood was a function of how thoroughly they'd built the case before moving. By the end of the second week after the motion denial, 3 things happened in rapid enough succession that she learned about them in a single morning. The first, Stuart Gaines entered a guilty plea to federal fraud charges, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and improper destruction of federal records. His attorney negotiated a cooperation agreement, which meant Gaines's testimony would be used in the trials of Holt and Speak. The plea included a statement, read into the record by the prosecutor and subsequently reported in full by 3 news outlets, that detailed the complaint suppression operation, how it worked, who directed it, what it protected, how long it had been running. The number, in Gaines's own account, was 53 complaints over 4 years. Not 45. 53. Dana read the coverage twice. The names of the complainants were not printed, protected, but the scope of what had been done to them was on the record now, permanent and public, in a federal court document that would exist as long as federal court documents existed. The second, Colonel Marcus Holt was formally charged with obstruction, abuse of authority, and conspiracy to commit fraud. He had already been removed from command, that had happened the afternoon of his arrest, but the formal charges meant the conduct had a legal name and a legal consequence. His statement, entered as part of his cooperation agreement, included a specific section on how he had been instructed to handle complaints from hospital staff, not by senior base leadership, but by a man he knew only as a retired general who had been present at 2 meetings in 18 months, and whose specific instructions Holt had followed because the man's clearance level and confidence had made saying no feel impossible. Power, Dana thought, reading that section. Not rank alone. The specific power of a person who has built a system around themselves so completely that people inside it stop being able to see the edges. The third thing was the one that required her to set down her phone and sit still for a while. Warren Speak, at 9:15 a.m. on a Wednesday in late October, was indicted on 7 federal counts. Obstruction of justice, fraud against the United States, abuse of classified information systems, conspiracy, Improper use of security classification as a punitive instrument, a charge that Solis had told her was rare enough that its inclusion had required sign-off from 2 levels above her. And 2 counts she hadn't anticipated. Witness intimidation for the 4 a.m. call she'd recorded after Croft had told her to, and misuse of a government contractor for personal legal protection. 7 counts. The indictment was 42 pages. A man who had spent 30 years building the architecture of his own untouchability was now the subject of a document that named every room in that architecture and what had been happening inside it. She sat with her phone in her hand for a while. Then she called Ferris. The colonel answered on the 3rd ring. "You've seen the news," Ferris said. "Yes." "How are you?" It was the same question Sylvia had asked, and Dana gave a slightly different answer this time because a slightly different answer was true. "Clearer than I was." "Good." A pause. "The conversation I mentioned, when you're ready, there's no deadline, but the position is real and the need is real." "I know." Dana looked at the window, the parking lot outside, ordinary and quiet. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes?" "Did you know about Speak's network before this?" A pause, not a hesitation, the pause of a person deciding how much truth to give and arriving at all of it. "We knew something was protecting Meridian's operation. We didn't know Speak was structural to it until your situation surfaced the financial records." Another pause. "Your presence at Caldwell was coincidental, Dana. Everything that followed was not." "It never is," she said. Ferris was quiet for a moment. "Call me when you're ready." "I will." She ended the call and sat for a while longer. She went to the gymnasium on a Saturday afternoon, 3 weeks after the indictment. She hadn't planned it exactly. She'd driven past it on the way back from a run and found herself pulling into the parking lot without having made a conscious decision to. The building was unlocked. It was always unlocked on weekend afternoons, open for base personnel. And she walked in. The space was empty. Not the loud empty of a place between events, but the genuine empty of a place simply at rest. The overhead lights were on their standby setting, lower, warmer, casting the high ceiling in a tone that made everything feel slightly provisional. She walked to the center of the floor. She stood there. Just stood. The tournament had been 5 weeks ago. Looking at the space now, it felt both longer and shorter than that. The way significant periods compress and expand depending on how much had moved inside them. She'd stood in this same spot and thought about what Calloway's expression was going to cost her. She'd been right about the cost. She'd been wrong about its upper limit. She hadn't known, standing here at the end of a tournament she'd won by being exactly what she was, that the thing she'd set in motion would reach a retired general in Scottsdale, Arizona. She hadn't known about Meridian or Gaines or the 53 complaints or the contractor running as Raymond Croft. She'd known about Calloway's expression and the feel of her knee and the 2 men in the parking lot who had watched her matches with an attention that was different from everyone else's. She'd moved through it the way she'd always moved through hard things, not by having the complete picture, but by being precise about the piece of it she could actually see. That was the thing she wished she could explain to people who asked how she'd done it. And some would ask, eventually, when the news coverage reached the people who asked those questions. The answer wasn't strategy. It wasn't courage in the cinematic sense. It was the simple, repeated practice of doing the next correct thing when the next correct thing was available, and waiting with as much patience as she could manage when it wasn't. She'd spent years developing that practice in environments where the cost of getting it wrong was not a suspension or a damaged career, but something she couldn't talk about in this room, or most other rooms. Caldwell had been smaller than that. It had also been harder in a different way, because in those classified environments, the enemy was external and the mission was shared. Here, the enemy had been institutional, and the thing being protected was a network of men who had decided that their comfort was worth more than the people they were supposed to serve. That kind of enemy didn't require different skills. It required the willingness to use the skills you had when the institution they were embedded in told you that using them was the problem. She thought about Owen Farrell staring at a complaint form for 2 weeks, about Sylvia Ortega quietly filing paper in a system that was increasingly paperless, about Brent Calloway, who had been used and had allowed himself to be used, and who was now in the uncomfortable position of living with both of those facts simultaneously. She thought about Rita Marsh in the corner of a burning room with her jacket against the door, who had done the correct intuitive thing and survived because of it. None of them had been trying to be anything in particular. They'd been trying to do the right thing in circumstances that made the right thing difficult. The difference between that and heroism was mostly a matter of who was watching. She stood on the gymnasium floor for a few more minutes. Then she walked out. The formal reinstatement came through on a Tuesday. Not dramatic, a document, a revised access badge, a brief meeting with the interim XO, who was carefully, visibly trying to strike the tone of an institution acknowledging an error without using the word error. She accepted the reinstatement paperwork with the neutral expression she kept for bureaucratic interactions and didn't make it difficult for him. The letter of recognition from the hospital was separate, signed by Voss, countersigned by the interim XO, citing her actions in the mass casualty event and the building fire. The language was formal and slightly stiff, the way recognition from institutions always was, but the facts it cited were accurate and its existence was its own kind of statement. She filed both documents in the folder on her kitchen counter next to the 3-page service summary. 3 documents. The life she'd lived, compressed to a manageable size, now fully able to be in the same folder because the thing that had been used to falsely separate them was no longer standing. She went back to work. Check. The night shift, her first official one back, was an ordinary shift in the best sense of the word. 2 chest pains, 1 elderly patient with a hip fracture who was in remarkable good spirits, and told Dana 3 complete stories about his time in Korea while she assessed him. A teenager who'd cut her hand on a fence, scared and trying not to show it, who Dana talked through the suturing in a tone that was matter-of-fact enough to be reassuring without being falsely cheerful. Around 2 in the morning, in the quiet stretch, she was charting at the nurse's station when Sylvia appeared at her elbow with 2 cups of coffee. Sylvia sat in the adjacent chair, which she almost never did, she was always moving, and handed Dana one of the cups. They drank in silence for a moment. "The new resident," Sylvia said eventually. "Second year. She asked me today who the nurse was who went into the building fire." Dana didn't respond. "I told her it was you." Sylvia looked at her. "She wanted to know why you did it." "What did you tell her?" Sylvia considered. "I told her you did it because you could, because sometimes that's the whole reason, and it's enough." Dana looked at her coffee. "That's about right. She's going to want to meet you. She can find me here." Sylvia smiled, not the careful, managed expression of a charge nurse maintaining professional composure, but something genuine and slightly tired and completely real. "Welcome back," she said. Dana drank her coffee. "Thanks, Sylvia. That's sad." She called Ferris on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks later. The conversation was what Ferris had said it would be. Not a commitment, not a formal offer, but a conversation between 2 people who understood the same things and were deciding together whether the next chapter made sense. Ferris described the position with the same directness she'd used in their first call. Medical operations lead, forward advisory capacity. A rebuilt unit operating at a scale and in context that required someone who could move between clinical precision and operational judgment without losing either. Dana asked 4 specific questions. Ferris answered all of them completely, including the one about what the unit had lost in its previous form and what rebuilding it had required. "I want to know," Dana said at the end, "if I take this, whether it's because it's what I'm supposed to do next, or whether it's because leaving feels easier than staying." Ferris was quiet for a moment. "Those aren't mutually exclusive." "No, but one of them is a better reason." "Which one do you think it is?" Dana looked at the window, the parking lot, the mountains, distant and blue. "The first one," she said. "I think it's the first one." "Then you have your answer." She said she'd be in touch within the week. She ended the call, sat for a while, and then began the practical work of figuring out what it meant to leave a place you'd never quite arrived at. The careful distribution of a life that had been held lightly, in readiness, for longer than she'd sometimes been willing to admit. She told Sylvia in person. Sylvia received it the way she received difficult information, directly, with the quiet absorption of someone who had developed the capacity to hold things without needing them to be different. "When?" Sylvia said. "End of the month. Maybe a week before." Sylvia nodded. She looked at Dana for a moment with an expression that contained several things at once. Something sad around the edges, something proud in the center, something pragmatic underneath that said the shift would need covering, and she was already calculating how. "You're good at this work," Sylvia said. "The hospital work." "I know. Whatever you're going to next, you'll be good at that too." Dana didn't deflect the statement or qualify it. She accepted it, because Sylvia had been watching her work for 14 months with the accurate eye of a person who did not give assessments she didn't mean. "Thank you," she said, "for everything, specifically the paper copies." Sylvia laughed, a short, real sound. "Keep yourself in one piece." "I'll try." She packed the apartment on a Friday evening. Not much to pack. The life she'd built here had been functional and light, as her lives tended to be. Furniture that belonged to the unit, a kitchen that held what she used and not what she stored, books she'd read and donated and read again from library shelves. The things that were genuinely hers fit in 2 bags and a box. The photograph she packed last. She held it for a moment before sliding it into the box. Mountains, low cloud, the specific silence of a high place. She'd taken it in a context she couldn't name at the end of something difficult, because she'd needed one thing from that place that had no weight attached to it. She'd carried it through 14 months in a town she'd never quite inhabited, through a tournament and a suspension and a burning building and a federal investigation and a man in a grocery store and a phone call that turned out to be the wrong person and one that turned out to be the right one. It was still just mountains, still just cloud. She put it in the box. She drove out of Heron Falls on a Saturday morning before the town was fully awake. The highway ran straight through open country and then began to climb. The mountains she'd been looking at for over a year finally resolving from distant shapes into specific terrain, ridgeline and treeline, and the particular texture of rock at altitude. She drove into them and through them and out the other side into country she hadn't seen before. She didn't have the radio on. She thought about what Solis had said in the conference room at the end of their first full session, after Dana had stopped talking and the recording device was off. Solis had said, "The law is supposed to protect people from exactly what happened to you. When it doesn't work right, someone has to be willing to say so out loud." Dana had thought at the time that the statement was well-intentioned and slightly beside the point. The law hadn't protected her. People had. Imperfect, scared, careful people who kept paper records and answered phone calls from strangers and handed over manila envelopes at 6 a.m. by a reservoir because the alternative was living the rest of their lives having chosen silence. The law was what happened after. It was the structure that gave those choices weight. Both things were necessary. Neither one was enough without the other. She drove for a while, holding that thought. Somewhere in the 3rd hour, she stopped at a pullout that overlooked a valley she didn't know the name of. Wide and gray-green in the October morning, a river running through it in long, flat curves that caught the light at intervals. She got out and stood at the guardrail and looked at it for a while. She wasn't thinking about Caldwell. She wasn't thinking about Speak or Holt or Gaines, whose trials were months away and whose outcomes were no longer something she needed to manage. She wasn't thinking about Calloway, who would live with his specific version of accountability in the specific way that was available to a person who had been used and had allowed themselves to be used. She wasn't thinking about the motion or the judge or the 47-page response. She was thinking about the nurse she'd been when she arrived at Caldwell. The quiet, slightly held-back version who'd been good at the work and careful not to take up too much space, who'd been running in the dark with no headphones and eating lunch alone and keeping a photograph in her locker, as though visibility itself was a risk. That person had been managing something, carrying an adaptation that had been useful once and had calcified into a reflex. The tournament hadn't been about proving something to 200 soldiers. She hadn't registered for it to make a point. She'd registered because she was tired of making herself smaller than she was, and it had been the most direct available expression of that particular exhaustion. Everything that followed had been the consequence of that one decision, not to be strategic or cautious or appropriately invisible, but to simply be what she actually was and let the pieces fall where they fell. She stood at the guardrail a little longer. Then she got back in the car and drove toward what was next. Not because she had all of it figured out, not because the work ahead was going to be easier than the work behind, but because she was done performing smallness for audiences who had never deserved the performance in the first place. The highway ran forward into country she hadn't seen yet. The mountains were all around her, and the light was good, and she drove.